The afternoon California sun filtered through the blinds of the modest San Diego home, casting long shadows across the living room where Daniel "Steel Dan" Harrington sat in his favorite armchair. At 93, his body had grown frail, but his piercing blue eyes remained as sharp as they had been half a century ago when they peered through the vision blocks of a Sherman tank. "Mr. Harrington, thank you for agreeing to this interview," said the young journalist, setting up his recording equipment. "The Historical Society is documenting veterans' experiences, especially those who served in armored divisions." Dan nodded, his weathered hands resting on the arms of his chair. On the wall behind him hung photographs spanning decades. A young man in uniform, a middle-aged professional receiving awards, family portraits with children and grandchildren. Evidence of a full life lived after the war. 40 years as an accountant, Dan said, following the journalist's gaze to the framed certification on the wall. "Built my own practice from nothing. Retired at 68. Can't complain about how things turned out." The journalist smiled, checking his notes. "Your military records show you served with distinction in the 4th Armored Division, commanding a Sherman tank through some of the most significant battles of the European campaign. But I'm curious about your background before the war." Dan's eyes flickered momentarily to a small, faded photograph on the side table. It showed a young family standing in front of a modest shop with foreign writing above the door. "I wasn't always Daniel Harrington," he said quietly. "I was born David Horowitz in Warsaw, Poland. My father owned a small watch repair shop. We were Jewish." The journalist leaned forward, sensing the story taking an unexpected turn. "I escaped Poland in 1938, just before the worst began. I was 17, sent ahead by my parents who promised they would follow." Dan paused, the weight of ancient grief briefly crossing his features. "They never did." "How did you get to America?" the journalist asked. "Through connections, bribes, and sheer luck. I arrived in New York with false papers and $10 sewn into the lining of my coat. Made my way to San Francisco, where a distant cousin had settled. Changed my name to Daniel Harrington. Thought it sounded American. Found work doing bookkeeping for small businesses." "So you were an illegal immigrant?" Dan's lips tightened into a thin smile. "Yes, an illegal immigrant with decent math skills and a head for numbers. I kept a low profile, learned English, tried to blend in. For almost 3 years it worked." "What changed?" "December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor." Dan's expression darkened. When America declared war on Germany, Poland was already occupied, and its government in exile declared war on Japan in solidarity with the United States. Overnight, I became not just an illegal resident, but an enemy alien, technically at least. The immigration department started rounding up Germans, Italians, Japanese, and yes, even Poles. The journalist's eyebrows rose. "I had no idea Poles were included in that. Most weren't affected, but those of us without proper papers were priority targets for deportation. Where they planned to deport us to, God only knows. Poland was under Nazi control." Dan shook his head. "I received a letter ordering me to report to the immigration office in San Francisco." "What did you do?" "I reported as ordered. Sat across from an agent named Sullivan. Decent man. He looked at my file, then at me, and said he could see I was no Nazi sympathizer. But rules were rules. He said deportation proceedings would begin within the month." Dan's eyes took on a faraway look as he recalled that pivotal moment. "I asked if there was any way I could stay and fight for America instead." Sullivan leaned back in his chair, thinking. "Finally, he suggested I enlist. Said the army might take me, war being what it was. He even offered to delay my file while I tried." "And they accepted you, even though you were here illegally?" Dan's laugh held both humor and bitterness. "Not immediately. I went to the recruitment office the next day. Stood in line with all these young American boys full of patriotic fervor. When it was my turn, the sergeant took one look at my papers and said they couldn't help me. I was an enemy alien without legal status." The journalist frowned. "So how did you eventually get in?" "Sullivan pulled some strings. Got me an interview with a Captain Patterson at the Army office. Patterson was a no-nonsense type. Asked me straight out if I would renounce my Polish citizenship. I asked where I should sign." Dan smiled at the memory. "Then he handed me a Bible and asked if I would swear allegiance to the United States. I did that too." "Just like that you were in?" "Just like that, April 1943. They needed men, especially ones who could speak multiple languages. I spoke Polish, Yiddish, German, and passable Russian. Captain Patterson said, 'Congratulations, Private Harrington. Report to Fort Knox, Kentucky for basic training next week.' The journalist glanced down at his notes. And that's where you first encountered tanks? Dan's eyes lit up with the first real spark of enthusiasm. Yes, Fort Knox. That's where my real American story begins, where I met the machine that would change my life, the M4 Sherman tank. Chapter 2. The Road to Fort Knox. The train rattled through the Kentucky countryside, carrying Daniel Harrington toward his uncertain future. Spring had painted the rolling hills in vibrant green, a stark contrast to the urban landscape he'd grown accustomed to in San Francisco. Among the sea of young American recruits, Dan felt conspicuously foreign despite his best efforts to blend in. "First time away from home?" asked the freckle-faced farm boy seated beside him. He couldn't have been more than 18. Dan nodded, choosing simplicity over the complicated truth. "You?" "First time outside Kansas," the boy replied, extending his hand. "Jimmy Collins." "Daniel Harrington," Dan said, shaking his hand firmly. "Think we'll see action?" Jimmy asked, his voice mixing excitement and apprehension. "I expect so," Dan replied, thinking of the newsreels showing the brutal fighting in North Africa and the Pacific. "That's what we're training for." When the train finally pulled into the station near Fort Knox, the reality of military life hit them immediately. Drill instructors shouted orders, herding the fresh recruits into formation before loading them onto olive-drab trucks bound for the base. Fort Knox sprawled across the Kentucky landscape like a small city of uniform buildings and training grounds. The home of the armored force, it hummed with the constant sound of engines and the metallic clank of tank treads. Dan had never seen so much military hardware in one place. The parade grounds lined with tanks, half-tracks, and armored cars. Basic training was a grueling ordeal designed to break down civilian habits and rebuild the recruits as soldiers. Dan, slightly older at 22 than many of his fellow trainees, found the physical demands particularly challenging. But his determination and discipline served him well. While other recruits complained, Dan reminded himself that each push-up, each mile run in full gear, each minute standing at attention in the sweltering Kentucky heat was another minute he wasn't being deported. 3 weeks into basic training, the recruits were introduced to the various specializations they might be assigned to. Dan stood with his platoon on the edge of a vast training field where different armored vehicles were displayed. "Listen up, ladies," their drill sergeant bellowed. "Today you'll get your first look at what the armored division is all about. Most of you will be assigned to one of these vehicles based on your aptitude tests. Pay attention." Dan's eyes were drawn immediately to the largest vehicle on the field, the M4 Sherman tank. Standing over 9 feet tall and 30 feet long, its olive-drab bulk dominated the landscape. A demonstrator crew put it through its paces, the 75mm gun traversing smoothly as the 30-ton behemoth maneuvered across the field. "That right there is America's answer to the German Panzers," the sergeant announced proudly. "The M4 Sherman medium tank, 30 tons of Detroit steel powered by a Ford V8 engine. Top speed 25 to 30 miles per hour on good terrain. Armed with a 75mm main gun, 230 caliber machine guns, and 150 caliber machine gun on the commander's cupola. 5-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and bow gunner." Dan listened intently as the sergeant detailed the tank's specifications, capabilities, and limitations. Something about the mechanical beast captivated him. Perhaps it was the idea of being protected behind inches of armor, rather than exposed in the infantry, or perhaps it was the tank's symbolic power. Whatever the reason, Dan found himself hoping he would be assigned to a tank crew. The next day, the recruits were called individually to receive their specialization assignments. Dan waited nervously as name after name was called. "Harrington Daniel," the administrative sergeant finally barked. Dan stepped forward. "Yes, Sergeant." The sergeant consulted his clipboard. "You scored unusually high on the mathematics and spatial reasoning tests. Report to Building 74 for additional assessment. Looks like they're considering you for something specific." Building 74 turned out to be an innocuous administrative office. Dan reported to the desk sergeant, who directed him to a small conference room where a captain and a lieutenant waited. "Private Harrington," the captain said, reviewing a folder. "I'm Captain Reynolds, and this is Lieutenant Burke. Have a seat." Dan sat ramrod straight on the edge of the chair. "Your test scores are impressive, especially in mathematics," Captain Reynolds continued. "Your file indicates you worked as a bookkeeper in civilian life." "Yes, sir," Dan confirmed, "for various businesses in San Francisco." "It also says you speak several languages, including German." "Yes, sir. Polish is my native language, but I also speak German, Yiddish, and some Russian." The officers exchanged glances. "What's your background with maps and navigation?" Lieutenant Burke asked. "I'm comfortable with them, sir. In Poland, I often help my father plan delivery routes for his business. I have a good sense of direction and spatial relationships." Captain Reynolds leaned forward. "Private Harrington, we're looking for men with specific aptitudes for our tank commander training program. Typically, we'd want someone with more experience or at least a natural-born citizen, but your test scores and language skills have caught our attention." Dan's heart rate accelerated. "Tank commander, sir? It's a significant responsibility," Reynolds continued. "A tank commander makes life or death decisions under pressure, coordinates with other tanks and infantry, reads maps, calculates firing solutions, and leads a crew of 4 other men. Your mathematical skills would be valuable for range finding and navigational calculations." "I'd be honored to be considered, sir," Dan said, trying to contain his excitement. "There's one complication," the captain said, his expression growing serious. "Your status as a non-citizen and technically an enemy alien. I understand you've been cleared for service, but command positions typically require citizenship." Dan's hopes began to deflate. "However," Lieutenant Burke interjected, "there's precedent for accelerated citizenship for those serving in combat roles, especially those with specialized skills. If you were to enter the tank commander training program and perform well, we could potentially expedite your citizenship process." "I'd do whatever it takes, sir," Dan said firmly. Captain Reynolds nodded slowly. "We're going to give you a chance, Private Harrington. You will join the specialized tank training program starting next week. It's intense, many wash out. But if you succeed, you'll be fast-tracked to a command position after some field experience." He slid a document across the table. "Sign here to acknowledge your selection." Dan's hand trembled slightly as he signed. He couldn't believe the turn his fortunes had taken, from facing deportation to potentially commanding an American tank. As he left Building 74 with his new orders, a mix of pride and determination surged through him. This was his chance to prove himself, to become a real American, and perhaps most importantly, to strike back at the forces that had consumed his homeland and family. His path was set. The next morning, Dan reported to the tank school, ready to learn everything about the machine that would become both his weapon and his home in the coming war. Chapter 3. Sherman and its enemies. The Sherman Tank School at Fort Knox was unlike anything Dan had experienced before. While basic training had been about physical conditioning and military discipline, tank school focused on technical knowledge, teamwork, and the complex skills needed to operate 30 tons of rolling steel. The training began with classroom instruction on the M4 Sherman's mechanical systems. Dan sat attentively in the front row, absorbing every detail about the tank's 4 GAA V8 engine, its transmission, suspension, and electrical systems. His background in mathematics and natural mechanical aptitudes served him well, allowing him to quickly grasp concepts that others struggled with. "The M4 Sherman is a marvel of American engineering and production," their instructor, Sergeant Miller, explained. "While it might not match some German tanks in firepower or armor thickness, we can build 10 Shermans for every Panzer IV and 50 for every Tiger. That's America's real advantage, mass production." During one lecture, they discussed the Sherman's various components in detail. "The standard M4 is powered by a 4 GAA V8 engine producing 450 horsepower, Miller continued, pointing to a cutaway diagram. "That gives us a power-to-weight ratio of about 15 horsepower per ton, which translates to good mobility on most terrain. Top speed is around 25 to 30 miles per hour on roads, considerably less in mud or snow." Dan took detailed notes, recognizing that understanding the machine's capabilities and limitations could mean the difference between life and death in combat. "The primary armament is the 75mm M3 gun," Miller explained, moving to another diagram. "Effective range against enemy tanks is about 900 yards, though you can hit stationary targets at greater distances. Maximum range is around 15,000 yards, but you'd need to be incredibly lucky to hit anything at that distance." A fellow trainee raised his hand. "Sergeant, how does our gun compare to German tanks?" Miller's expression grew serious. "I'll be honest with you, men. Our 75mm gun is adequate against most German tanks you'll encounter, like the Panzer III or early Panzer IV models. But the newer German tanks, the Panther and Tiger, have much thicker armor. You'll need to aim for weak points or use flanking maneuvers. That's why tactics and crew coordination are as important as technical specifications. The classroom instruction was supplemented with hands-on training. The trainees spent hours learning each crew position: driver, bow gunner, loader, gunner, and commander, rotating through roles to understand the responsibilities of every man in the tank. Dan excelled particularly at gunnery. His mathematical mind calculated range and deflection adjustments with remarkable accuracy, earning him the nickname Deadeye Dan from his instructors. When they practiced with live ammunition on the firing range, Dan consistently scored the highest hit percentages. "You've got a gift, Harrington," Sergeant Miller commented after one particularly impressive session. "Your gunners will appreciate having a commander who understands ballistics so well." As the training progressed, they began studying the enemy tanks they would face in combat. The classroom walls were lined with detailed schematics and photographs of German armor. "This is the Panzer IV," their instructor explained, pointing to a diagram. "Until recently, it was the backbone of the German armored forces. Early models had 50 millimeters of frontal armor and a short-barreled 75 millimeter gun, but newer versions have been upgraded to 80 millimeters of frontal armor and a long-barreled high-velocity 75 millimeter gun that can penetrate our Sherman at over 1,100 yards. Fortunately, it still has relatively thin side armor, 30 to 40 millimeter, which our 75 millimeter can penetrate easily." He moved to the next diagram, showing a much larger tank. "This monster is the Tiger I. Weighing in at 56 tons, it has 100 millimeters of frontal armor and 80 millimeters on the sides. It's armed with the deadly 88 Bastogne KWK-36 gun, which can knock out a Sherman from over 2,000 yards. If you encounter a Tiger, conventional wisdom is to call for artillery or air support. If that's not available, use your Sherman's superior mobility to outflank it and aim for the sides or rear. Never engage a Tiger head-on if you can avoid it." The final diagram showed a sleek, angular tank. The Panther is Germany's newest medium tank and possibly their best. Inspired by our Sherman and the Soviet T-34, it combines excellent armor protection, 80 millimeter sloped frontal plate, effectively 140 millimeter, with a high-velocity 75-meter gun that's even more powerful than the Tiger's 88 millimeter in terms of armor penetration. Like the Tiger, avoid frontal engagements. Use your mobility advantage and numerical superiority. Dan studied these enemy tanks intensely, knowing his life and the lives of his future crew would depend on understanding their capabilities. The Sherman's vulnerabilities became increasingly apparent. Its relatively thin armor and inferior gun compared to the latest German tanks. The Americans had nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson after the popular cigarette lighter whose slogan was "Lights first time, every time," a dark reference to how quickly the tank could catch fire when hit. One day, Colonel Howard Wilson, a distinguished tank commander recently returned from North Africa, came to address the trainees. Wilson was a tall, imposing figure with piercing eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice filling the room, "you've been learning about the technical specifications of our tanks versus theirs. Some of you might be concerned about facing Panthers and Tigers with your Sherman. Let me tell you something important. Tank battles aren't won by who has the better tank on paper. They're won by who makes better decisions faster." He paced before them, hands clasped behind his back. "The German tanks have better guns and thicker armor. Yes, but they're also slower, less reliable, and far fewer in number. Our Shermans are faster, more reliable, and we have lots of them. We also have better coordination, better logistics, and better air support." Colonel Wilson stopped directly in front of Dan. "What's your name, soldier?" "Private Harrington, sir," Dan replied, standing at attention. "Harrington, if you encounter a Tiger tank on the battlefield, what would you do?" Dan thought for a moment. "Avoid frontal engagement, sir. Use terrain for cover, attempt to flank, and aim for side or rear armor. If possible, coordinate with other tanks to attack from multiple angles simultaneously." Wilson nodded approvingly. "Good. Remember this. In battle, a good plan executed quickly is far better than a perfect plan executed too late. The Sherman gives you speed and maneuverability. Use them. The commander who recognizes opportunities and acts decisively will prevail, regardless of technical disadvantages." Those words would stay with Dan throughout his military career. While he continued to study the technical aspects of tank warfare, he began to appreciate that success in battle depended on more than just hardware. It required quick thinking, adaptability, in decisive leadership. As their training advanced, the tank commander candidates were assigned to training crews and began practicing tactical exercises in full-scale battle simulations. Dan was appointed commander of a training crew that included Max Greenbaum, a sharp-eyed former hunter from Montana, as gunner, Tommy Rizzo, a stocky Italian-American from Chicago, as loader, Frank Johnson, a former race car mechanic from Indianapolis, as driver, and Joey Ramirez, a quick-witted Mexican-American from Texas, as bow gunner. During these exercises, Dan developed his own unique approach to tank command, combining the standard doctrine with innovations based on his mathematical background. He created a set of quick calculation methods for range finding and lead estimation that allowed his gunner to acquire and hit targets faster than any other training crew. "Your methods are unorthodox, Harrington," their tactical instructor commented after one particularly successful exercise. "But I can't argue with the results. Just make sure your future crew can follow your thinking." Dan took the advice to heart, working to simplify his methods and teach them to his crewmates. By the end of the training, they had bonded into an effective unit, consistently outperforming the other training crews in tactical exercises. On their final day at tank school, Colonel Wilson returned to address the graduating class. "You men are about to join the most powerful armored force in history," he declared. "You'll face challenges unlike anything you've experienced in training. You'll be tested to your limits. But remember, American tankers don't win because we have perfect tanks. We win because we adapt, we improvise, and we overcome. Carry that spirit with you to the battlefield." As Dan stood at attention with his fellow graduates, he felt a surge of pride. He was no longer just a refugee from a conquered nation. He was becoming a warrior for his new country, ready to take the fight back to those who had destroyed his homeland and family. The Sherman tank, with all its strengths and weaknesses, would be his chariot of retribution. Chapter 4. The New American. Fort Smith, Arkansas, peered through the train window as little more than a collection of military buildings and civilian structures nestled against the backdrop of rolling hills. After completing his specialized tank training at Fort Knox with top marks, Dan had expected to be shipped directly to a combat unit, preparing for overseas deployment. Instead, he had received orders to report to Fort Smith for what the paperwork cryptically described as administrative processing. Dan stepped off the train into the humid Arkansas heat, duffel bag slung over his shoulder. A corporal waited on the platform, checking names against a clipboard. "Private Harrington?" the corporal called as Dan approached. "Yes, Corporal." "Follow me, sir. Transportation's waiting." The transportation turned out to be a staff car with a driver. Dan climbed into the back seat, his confusion growing. This kind of treatment wasn't standard for a mere private. "Can you tell me what this is about, Corporal?" Dan asked as they drove through the base. "Not my place to say, sir. First Sergeant DeMarco will explain everything." They arrived at the base headquarters, and the corporal escorted Dan to an office where a powerfully built man with an impressive mustache sat behind a desk. The nameplate read 1SG Anthony DeMarco. "Private Harrington reporting as ordered, First Sergeant," Dan said, standing at attention and saluting. DeMarco returned the salute and looked Dan over with calculating eyes. "At ease, Private. Take a seat." Dan sat stiffly on the edge of the chair. DeMarco opened a folder on his desk. "Your file makes for interesting reading, Harrington. Polish immigrant, enemy alien status, outstanding performance in tank commander training. Colonel Wilson himself wrote a commendation for your tactical innovations." He looked up. Not the typical recruit. "No, First Sergeant." "You know why you're here?" "No, First Sergeant. My orders just said to report for administrative processing." DeMarco leaned back in his chair. His Brooklyn accent became more pronounced as he relaxed. "I'm not going to have a foreigner in my army. Tomorrow morning at 0600, be at the courthouse downtown in your Class A uniform. Don't be late." Dan felt his stomach drop. After everything, was he being processed for deportation after all? "May I ask what this is regarding, First Sergeant?" DeMarco's expression remained unreadable. "You'll find out tomorrow. Dismissed." Dan spent a restless night in the temporary barracks, his mind racing with possibilities. Had his enemy alien status finally caught up with him? Was his promising military career about to end before it truly began? The next morning, Dan reported to the courthouse as ordered, wearing his perfectly pressed Class A uniform. First Sergeant DeMarco was waiting outside in an equally immaculate uniform, complete with rows of campaign ribbons and a chest full of medals that spoke of extensive combat experience. "Right on time, Harrington. Good." DeMarco nodded approvingly, then gestured toward the entrance. Let's go. They entered the courthouse and proceeded to a courtroom where several officers were already seated, including Captain Patterson from Fort Knox and a man Dan didn't recognize wearing a judge's robes. The room also contained the post commander, chief of police, and several other local dignitaries. Private Daniel Harrington, the judge called. Please approach the bench. Dan stepped forward, heart pounding. The judge looked down at him solemnly. Private Harrington, are you prepared to take your oath of American citizenship today? The question took Dan completely by surprise. Citizenship? Here? Now? Yes, Your Honor, he managed to reply, his voice steady despite his shock. What followed was a brief but dignified ceremony. Dan raised his right hand and repeated the oath of allegiance to the United States, formally renouncing his Polish citizenship. The judge then presented him with his naturalization certificate. Congratulations, Mr. Harrington. You are now a citizen of the United States of America. The room broke into applause as the assembled officers and officials came forward to congratulate him. Captain Patterson shook his hand firmly. This was arranged on an accelerated schedule because of your performance in the specialized role we have in mind for you, Patterson explained. Being a tank commander requires citizenship. First Sergeant DeMarco approached next, a rare smile cracking his stern facade. He took Dan's citizenship papers and carefully placed them in an official envelope. These go into your military file for safekeeping, he said. You'll get them back when you receive an honorable discharge, not before. Consider it motivation to serve with distinction. Then he handed Dan a small box. Inside was the single silver bar of a second lieutenant. There's a commission ceremony at 1300 hours, DeMarco said. You're being promoted directly to officer rank based on your exceptional performance and specialized skills. Colonel Wilson pulled some strings. Don't make him regret it. Dan stared at the lieutenant's bar in disbelief. First Sergeant, I don't understand. This is the Army recognizing talent when it sees it, Lieutenant Harrington, DeMarco interrupted. We need tank commanders with your abilities. The war isn't waiting for anyone to move through the ranks the traditional way. Thank you, First Sergeant, Dan said, still struggling to process everything. DeMarco's expression turned serious again. Don't thank me yet. You're being assigned to the 4th Armored Division. They're shipping out to England next month to prepare for the invasion of Europe. Before that, you'll go through an accelerated officer training course. It won't be easy. I understand, First Sergeant. One more thing, DeMarco added, his voice lowering. I know your background, Polish Jew, family probably still in occupied territory if they're alive at all. That gives you more motivation than most to fight the Nazis. Just don't let it cloud your judgment. A tank commander needs a cool head. Dan nodded solemnly. I won't let personal feelings interfere with my duty, First Sergeant. Good man. Now there's $100 in this envelope. DeMarco handed him a small packet. Courtesy of the officers' mess, go into town, buy yourself dinner, celebrate becoming an American. Report back by 800 tomorrow for the start of your officer training. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of intensive training. Dan underwent a condensed version of officer candidate school, learning the additional responsibilities and protocols required of a commissioned officer. His days were filled with classes on leadership, military strategy, and command responsibilities, while his evenings were spent studying and preparing for the next day's challenges. Throughout this period, Dan was acutely aware of his unique position. Most officers came from military academies or were battlefield promotions after years of service. As a foreign-born citizen with just months of military experience, he knew he would need to work twice as hard to earn the respect of both his superiors and the men he would command. Finally, with his officer training complete, Second Lieutenant Daniel Harrington received his official orders. Report to Camp Bowie, Texas, to join the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division as a platoon leader. From there, they would deploy to England to prepare for the eventual invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. The night before his departure, Dan sat alone in his quarters, contemplating the remarkable turn his life had taken. 3 years ago, he had been an illegal immigrant working as a bookkeeper in San Francisco. Now he was a United States citizen, an Army officer, and soon to be a tank commander heading to war. He took out a small notebook and began writing a letter, not to anyone who would receive it, but to his parents and sister who had remained in Warsaw. He didn't know if they were alive or dead, but writing to them helped him process his thoughts. Dear family, he wrote in Polish, tomorrow I leave for England with the 4th Armored Division. Soon I will be in Europe, perhaps even close to Poland. I promise you this, I will make the Germans pay for what they have done to our homeland. And when the war is over, I will come find you, wherever you are." He closed the notebook and placed it in his footlocker alongside his few personal possessions. As he prepared for bed, Lieutenant Daniel Harrington made another silent promise to himself. He would return to Poland not as the frightened boy who had fled, but as an American officer who had helped liberate Europe. The journey to Camp Bowie was Dan's first experience traveling across America as an officer rather than a private. The respect shown to the uniform with its silver lieutenant's bar was a new experience. Civilians offering their seats on crowded trains, waitresses refusing to accept payment for coffee, elderly men stopping to salute him in train stations. He arrived at Camp Bowie to find the 4th Armored Division in its final stages of preparation for overseas deployment. The massive camp buzzed with activity, tanks undergoing final maintenance checks, supply convoys moving equipment, soldiers drilling and training. Dan reported to the headquarters of the 37th Tank Battalion. "Lieutenant Harrington reporting for duty." "Sir," he said, saluting the battalion executive officer, a captain named Harrison. Captain Harrison returned the salute and reviewed Dan's orders. "Welcome to the 37th, Lieutenant. You're assigned to command 3rd Platoon, Company B. They're short an officer since Lieutenant Parker was transferred last month." "Thank you, sir. I'm eager to meet my platoon." "You'll find them at the motor pool. They're conducting maintenance on their Shermans before we ship out next week." Harrison studied Dan for a moment. "Your file says you went through the Specialized Tank Commander program at Knox. That's good. We need officers who know their business. But these men have been training together for months. It'll take time to earn their trust." "I understand, sir." "One more thing, Lieutenant. Your accent, Polish?" "Yes, sir. The men don't care where you're from as long as you keep them alive in combat. Remember that." Dan made his way to the motor pool where he found 3rd Platoon working on their tanks. 5 M4 Shermans stood in a row, their engines exposed as crews performed maintenance. A grizzled staff sergeant noticed Dan's approach and called the men to attention. "Officer on deck!" The tankers snapped to attention, some climbing down from their vehicles to form a line. "At ease," Dan said. "I'm Lieutenant Harrington, your new platoon leader." The staff sergeant stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant Miller, platoon sergeant, sir. These are the tank commanders of 3rd Platoon." Dan shook hands with each of his tank commanders, all sergeants with varying degrees of experience. None had seen combat yet, but most had been with the unit since its formation. "I know I'm new to the unit," Dan addressed them after introductions, "but I'm not new to tanks. I've spent the last 6 months learning everything about the Sherman and how to fight it effectively. I don't pretend to know everything, and I'll rely on your experience with this unit. In return, I promise to do everything in my power to make this the most effective tank platoon in the battalion." His words were met with cautious nods. They would reserve judgment until they saw him in action, exactly as Dan would have done in their position. Over the next week, Dan threw himself into learning everything about his new command, the personalities of his tank commanders, the maintenance status of each vehicle, the strengths and weaknesses of his platoon. He spent hours with each crew, learning their backgrounds and specialties, and conducted training exercises to assess their proficiency. His own tank crew consisted of Sergeant Maxwell as gunner, Corporal Donovan as loader, Private First Class Wilson as driver, and Private Garcia as bow gunner. All were competent, if somewhat skeptical, of their new lieutenant with the foreign accent. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Sergeant Maxwell asked after their 3rd day of training together. "Always, Sergeant. The men are wondering, well, with your accent and all, how you ended up commanding an American tank platoon." Dan considered how to respond. Honesty, he decided, would serve him best. "I was born in Poland," he said, "escaped before the Germans invaded, came to America, became a citizen, and joined the army because I wanted to fight back. The rest is in my service record." Maxwell nodded slowly. "Appreciate the straightforward answer, sir. Explains why you pushed so hard on the training against German armor tactics." "I've studied our enemies carefully," Dan replied, "and I intend for us all to come home alive after teaching them a lesson they won't forget." A ghost of a smile crossed Maxwell's face. "That's an objective we can all get behind, sir." 1 week later, the 4th Armored Division began its journey to the East Coast ports, where transport ships waited to carry them to England. Their Sherman tanks were loaded onto rail cars while the men traveled by troop train. As the American countryside rolled past the windows, Dan reflected on how far he had come. The final stage of their journey would take them across the Atlantic on the RMS Queen Mary, converted from a luxury liner to a troop transport capable of carrying up to 15,000 soldiers. The massive ship would travel without escort, relying on its speed to outrun German U-boats. As they prepared to board, Dan gathered his platoon for a final word on American soil. "Men, we're heading into the greatest conflict in human history," he told them. "When we return to these shores, it will be as victors who helped free Europe from tyranny. Remember your training, trust each other, and know that I will do everything in my power to lead you effectively." The Queen Mary departed New York Harbor on a foggy morning, joining a dangerous cat-and-mouse game with German submarines lurking in the Atlantic. Despite the threat, Dan found himself standing at the rail each evening, looking eastward toward Europe. Somewhere ahead lay England, then France, and eventually, perhaps, Poland. As the distance to his homeland decreased, his determination grew. One night, as he stood at the rail, Staff Sergeant Miller joined him. "Beautiful night, sir," Miller commented, lighting a cigarette. "It is," Dan agreed. "Looking forward to getting into the fight, Lieutenant?" "I am. I have unfinished business in Europe." Miller studied him thoughtfully. "Most of us are fighting for America. You're fighting for something more personal, aren't you, sir?" Dan turned to face his platoon sergeant. "I'm an American now, Sergeant. I fight for America. But yes, I also fight to liberate my homeland and to find my family, if they're still alive." "Fair enough, sir. Just make sure that second mission doesn't interfere with the first. These men need a clear-headed commander." "It won't, Sergeant. I assure you." As Miller walked away, Dan turned back to the dark Atlantic. "I'm coming back," he whispered in Polish, a promise to both his past and his future. "And when I do, it will be in an American tank, as an American officer. I will find you." The Queen Mary continued its journey through U-boat-infested waters, carrying Lieutenant Daniel Harrington and thousands of other American soldiers toward their date with history in the European theater of World War II. The English countryside rolled past the train windows, a patchwork of emerald fields and quaint villages that seemed untouched by the ravages of war. Lieutenant Daniel Harrington sat with his tank crews, watching this peaceful landscape with a strange sense of dissonance. They had arrived in Liverpool 2 days earlier after an uneventful Atlantic crossing, fortunate to have evaded the German U-boats that still prowled the shipping lanes despite the Allies' growing naval dominance. "Hard to believe there's a war on, looking at this," remarked Sergeant Maxwell, gesturing toward the pastoral scene outside. "Wait until you see London," said a British liaison officer seated across from them. "The countryside might look peaceful, but the cities have taken a beating. Jerry's V1s and Vs are still coming over. Random terror weapons they are." Dan had read about the V1 buzz bombs and the newer V2 rockets in intelligence briefings. Unlike conventional bombing raids that could be detected and defended against, these unmanned weapons struck without warning, bringing sudden death from above to civilian populations. "We're billeted near London then?" Dan asked. The British officer nodded. "Aldershot, training grounds and staging areas. Your tanks will be following by cargo ship arriving next week. Until then, you'll be going through orientation and combined operations training with our armored units." The 4th Armored Division was part of the massive American buildup in England, preparing for the eventual invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. When Dan's platoon arrived at their assigned base, they found a sprawling military camp with British and American forces working side by side. The Americans brought overwhelming industrial might and fresh troops, while the British contributed battle-tested experience from years of fighting. During their first week in England, Dan received permission to visit London on a 48-hour pass. He had 2 objectives: to observe firsthand how the British capital had endured years of bombing, and to meet with British tank officers who had actual combat experience against German armor. London was a revelation. Despite years of the Blitz in the current V-weapon campaign, the city remained defiant. Buildings stood in ruins next to others that continued business as usual. Sandbags and air raid shelters had become part of the urban landscape. Most striking to Dan was the composure of the civilians, who carried on with their daily lives despite the constant threat from the skies. He was walking near Trafalgar Square when the air raid sirens began to wail. Around him, Londoners calmly but quickly moved toward the nearest shelter. Following their example, Dan descended into an underground station serving as a public shelter. Inside, hundreds of people sat on platforms and stairs, some reading books, others knitting, children playing quiet games. The atmosphere was one of resigned routine rather than panic. "American, are you?" asked an elderly gentleman seated next to Dan. "Yes, sir, Lieutenant Harrington, U.S. Army." "Thought so. The uniform gives it away." The man extended his hand. "George Pembroke, Air raid warden for this district. First time in a shelter? It is, Dan admitted. I'm impressed by how calm everyone is. Practice makes perfect, Lieutenant. Been doing this since 1940. The V1s are actually easier to handle than the bombing raids. At least with the buzz bombs, you can hear them coming. It's when the engine cuts out that you need to worry, means it's about to drop. As if on cue, the distinctive sputtering sound of a V1 engine could be heard overhead, growing louder. The conversation in the shelter dimmed as people listened. Then came an abrupt silence as the engine cut out, followed seconds later by a ground-shaking explosion that sent dust filtering down from the ceiling. That was close, Pembroke remarked calmly. Probably hit Covent Garden area. Dan was struck by the British resilience, their ability to endure years of bombing without breaking. It reinforced his belief in the Allied cause. If civilians could show such courage, soldiers could do no less. The following day, Dan met with Captain William Thornton of the British 7th Armored Division, veteran of the North African campaign against Rommel's Afrika Korps. They met at a small pub near the British tank training grounds, where Thornton had agreed to share his experiences fighting German tanks. "The Sherman's a good machine in many ways," Thornton said after they had exchanged pleasantries. "Reliable, easy to maintain in the field, decent mobility. But I won't sugarcoat it, Lieutenant. Its gun and armor are inadequate against the newer German tanks." "I've studied the technical comparisons," Dan replied. "The 75mm gun struggles against Panther and Tiger frontal armor." Thornton nodded grimly. "In North Africa, we learned the hard way that a Tiger can kill a Sherman from over 2,000 yards, while we need to close to within 500 yards, named for weak points to have any chance. Those aren't good odds." "What tactics proved effective?" "Numbers, mobility, and coordination." Thornton pulled out a small notebook and sketched a diagram. "The Germans typically have superior individual tanks, but fewer of them, with less reliable mechanics. We would use 3 or 4 Shermans to engage a single Tiger or Panther. One tank would draw fire while the others maneuvered to attack the flanks or rear." Dan studied the diagram intently. "High casualties with that approach?" "Yes," Thornton admitted. "Usually lost at least 1 tank per engagement. But we've been working on a solution." He flipped to another page. "We've modified some Shermans with the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun. We call them Fireflies. The 17-pounder can penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at over 1,000 yards." Dan's eyes widened. "That changes the equation significantly." "Indeed, but we don't have enough 17-pounders for all Shermans. Typically, we assign 1 Firefly to each troop of 4 tanks." Thornton tapped his diagram. "The standard Shermans maneuver and engage the enemy at closer ranges, while the Firefly stays back and provides overwatch with its superior gun." As Dan studied the British tactics, an idea began forming in his mind. The standard American doctrine treated all Shermans as interchangeable. But what if they adopted a more specialized approach, using the rare Fireflies strategically within a coordinated unit? "Captain, have you considered grouping your Fireflies differently?" Dan asked. "Perhaps 2 Fireflies supporting 4 standard Shermans, operating as a cohesive wolf pack, with the Fireflies targeting enemy heavies, while the standards handle lighter vehicles and provide smoke cover." Thornton considered the suggestion with interest. "Novel approach. Concentrates your heavy-hitting capability, but leaves other units without Firefly support. High risk, potentially high reward." They spent hours discussing tactical variations, with Dan applying his mathematical mind to calculate optimal firing solutions and formation movements. By the end of their meeting, Thornton was impressed enough to introduce Dan to several other British tank officers, expanding his network of experienced mentors. When Dan returned to his unit, he compiled his observations into a detailed report for his company commander, including the Steel Wolf Pack tactical concept he had developed. The response was less enthusiastic than he had hoped. "Interesting theory, Harrington," Captain Lewis said after reviewing the report, "but it deviates too far from established doctrine. Division Command wants consistent tactical approaches across all units. We'll stick with standard procedures for now." Dan was disappointed but not deterred. He focused on training his platoon to the highest standard, incorporating lessons from the British while officially adhering to American doctrine. If the opportunity arose in combat, he would be prepared to implement his ideas. As the weeks passed, their Sherman tanks arrived, and the real work began. Maintaining the vehicles, conducting live fire exercises, and practicing coordinated maneuvers with other Allied units. The invasion of Europe was approaching, though few knew the exact timeline. During a night exercise in late May, Dan's tank developed a fuel line problem that required immediate attention. While his crew worked on repairs, Dan stepped away to stretch his legs. The night was clear, offering a rare glimpse of stars in the usually clouded English sky. "Beautiful night," came a voice from behind him. Dan turned to see Colonel Howard Wilson, who had recently arrived in England to take command of their battalion. "Yes, sir," Dan replied, snapping to attention. "At ease, Lieutenant. Harrington, isn't it? I remember you from Fort Knox." "Yes, sir. I'm surprised you remember." Wilson smiled slightly. "I make it a point to remember promising officers. Your instructors spoke highly of your tactical acumen and gunnery skills. How are you finding command of your platoon?" "The men are excellent, sir. Well-trained and motivated." "And your tanks?" Dan hesitated before answering honestly. "The Shermans are reliable machines, sir, but I have concerns about their combat effectiveness against the newer German tanks we're likely to face." Wilson studied him carefully. "Concerns shared by many, Lieutenant. I've read your report on the British Firefly modifications and your Steel Wolf Pack concept, creative thinking." "Thank you, sir. I hope we might consider—" "Unfortunately," Wilson interrupted, "Theater Command has already established tactical doctrine for the coming operation. We'll have limited Firefly support, primarily in British units. We have to work with what we're given." Dan nodded, accepting the reality. "That said," Wilson continued, "battlefield conditions have a way of requiring adaptation. Good commanders recognize when doctrine needs adjustment. Keep thinking, Harrington." "Yes, sir." Wilson turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. I understand you're of Polish extraction." "Yes, sir. I became a U.S. citizen last year." "Any family still in Poland?" "My parents and sister were in Warsaw when the Germans invaded. I haven't heard from them since." Wilson's expression softened slightly. "When we push into Germany, Lieutenant, you'll face personal as well as professional challenges. Keep your head clear. Your men need your judgment unclouded by emotion." "I understand, sir." "Good. I'll be watching your progress with interest." After Wilson departed, Dan stood alone beneath the stars, contemplating the colonel's words. The invasion of Europe would bring him closer to discovering his family's fate, but it would also test his ability to balance personal mission with professional duty. That balance was nearly disrupted 2 days later during a combined training exercise with a British armored unit. As Dan's platoon maneuvered across the training ground, a sharp pain suddenly tore through his side. He gasped, doubling over in the commander's cupola of his Sherman. "Lieutenant, you all right?" called Maxwell from the gunner's position below. Dan straightened with effort, cold sweat beading on his forehead. "Fine, Sergeant. Just a cramp." The pain continued throughout the exercise, but Dan refused to acknowledge it, focusing instead on directing his platoon through the complex maneuvers. Only when they returned to base did he seek out the medical officer. "Appendicitis," the doctor diagnosed after examining him. "We need to operate immediately." "How long for recovery?" Dan asked, thinking of the impending invasion. "At least 3 weeks before you can return to full duty." 3 weeks. The invasion could happen any day. If Dan underwent surgery, he would miss the initial landing and early fighting. His platoon would be assigned a replacement commander, breaking the bonds of trust he had carefully cultivated. Dan made a decision. "Doctor, is there any way to manage this without immediate surgery? Something to get me through the next few weeks?" The doctor looked skeptical. "Lieutenant, a ruptured appendix can be fatal. This isn't something to gamble with." "I understand the risk, but my men need me for the invasion. Once we're established in France, I'll report for surgery, I promise." After lengthy discussion, the doctor reluctantly provided strong antibiotics to temporarily reduce the inflammation, with strict orders to report any worsening symptoms immediately. Dan agreed, knowing he was taking a significant personal risk, but unwilling to abandon his platoon before the most critical operation of the war. No one in his unit learned of his condition. Dan endured the pain stoically, popping antibiotics when no one was looking, focusing on final preparations for the invasion. The date was still classified, but rumors circulated that it would be soon, very soon. On June 5th, all leaves were canceled and units were confined to base. The next morning, Dan learned that Allied forces had landed in Normandy. The invasion, D-Day, had begun. However, the 4th Armored Division would not deploy immediately. As part of General Patton's Third Army, they would follow the initial assault forces once a secure beachhead was established. The waiting was agonizing. Dan's platoon continued training while monitoring reports from Normandy. His appendicitis stabilized with medication, allowing him to function normally, though occasional pain reminded him of the ticking time bomb within his body. Finally, in mid-July, the order came. The 4th Armored Division would deploy to France. As Dan prepared his platoon for embarkation, he felt a complex mix of emotions: anticipation, anxiety, determination, and a deep sense that he was taking his first real step toward personal reckoning with the forces that had torn his family apart. The crossing to France was mercifully uneventful. They landed not on the invasion beaches, but at a newly constructed temporary harbor, entering a France already secured by previous waves of Allied forces. The devastation of Normandy was sobering: shattered villages, cratered fields, burned-out vehicles littering the roadside. This was the reality of war, far removed from the sanitized maps and theoretical exercises of their training. As they moved inland to their assembly area, Dan watched the faces of his crew, seeing in them the same mix of awe and apprehension he felt. They had trained extensively for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare them for the actual experience of entering a war zone. "Remember your training," he told his platoon as they prepared their tanks for combat operations. "Trust your equipment, trust each other, and remember that the best way to survive is to ensure the enemy doesn't. We've practiced every scenario, studied every German tank. Now we put that knowledge to work." The men nodded soberly, their earlier bravado replaced by focused determination. The next day they would join the larger offensive, pushing out of the Normandy Peninsula into the heart of France. The real test was about to begin. Chapter 6. Trial by Fire. The roar of the Sherman's Ford V8 engine filled the confined space of the tank as 3rd Platoon moved along the narrow French country road. Lieutenant Daniel Harrington stood in the commander's cupola, head and shoulders exposed above the turret, scanning the terrain through binoculars. 2 months had passed since their arrival in France. The 4th Armored Division had missed the brutal hedgerow fighting of the Normandy campaign, but had joined General Patton's 3rd Army breakout operation, racing across France at a pace that surprised even the Allied high command. Now, in early September, they were approaching the town of Harrington near the German border. Intelligence reports indicated significant German armored forces in the area, potentially including the dreaded Panther tanks. After weeks of relatively light resistance, they might soon face their first major tank battle. The French countryside rolled past, a patchwork of small farms and woods still showing the fading colors of summer. To the untrained eye, it might have appeared peaceful, but Dan noted the telltale signs of impending battle: abandoned farmhouses, the absence of civilians, distant artillery rumbles. "All tanks, maintain interval," Dan spoke into his radio. "Gunners, watch those tree lines. Germans like to position Panthers at the edges of woods to break up their silhouettes." His platoon consisted of 5 Shermans advancing in a loose wedge formation. Dan's tank, which the crew had named Iron Justice, led the formation. Despite his ongoing appendicitis issue, which he continued to manage with the antibiotics, Dan had earned his crew's respect through his cool decision-making and tactical acumen during their advance across France. The inside of the Sherman was a world unto itself, cramped, noisy, and perpetually vibrating from the powerful engine. In the summer heat, temperatures inside could reach 120 degrees. The crew had adapted to their rolling metal home, developing an almost balletic coordination in the confined space. Below Dan, Sergeant Maxwell manned the gunner's position, eyes glued to the periscopic sight, ready to traverse the 75mm gun at the first sign of enemy armor. Corporal Donovan served as loader, shells prepared for rapid loading. Private First Class Wilson controlled the tank from the driver's position in the hull, while Private Garcia operated the bow machine gun and served as assistant driver. "Lieutenant," Maxwell called up from the gunner's seat, "movement at 2 o'clock, edge of that orchard." Dan swung his binoculars to the indicated position, focusing on the distant tree line. A dark shape moved between the trees, too large for infantry, too deliberate for civilian vehicles. "All tanks, possible contact. 2 o'clock, orchard edge," Dan radioed to his platoon. "Hold position." He continued observing, trying to identify the contact. The shape emerged partially from the trees, the unmistakable angular front hull of a German Panzer IV. "Contact confirmed. Panzer IV at 2 o'clock, range approximately 900 yards. Dan's voice remained calm despite the surge of adrenaline. This was their first enemy tank encounter. "Gunner, APCBC round, tank 2 o'clock, edge of orchard." "APCBC up," Donovan announced as he slammed an armor-piercing round into the breech. "Identified," Maxwell confirmed, adjusting his sight. "Fire when ready," Dan ordered. The Sherman rocked as the 75 millimeter gun discharged, the shell streaking toward the German tank. It struck just to the right of the target, sending dirt and debris skyward. "Adjust left 5, fire again," Dan commanded. Before Maxwell could fire a second shot, the German tank responded. A flash erupted from its gun, and seconds later a shell whistled overhead, missing Dan's Sherman by yards. "All tanks, engage," Dan ordered his platoon. 2 and 3, flank left. 4 and 5, with me. The platoon split as ordered, initiating the maneuver they had practiced countless times. The German tank was soon caught in a crossfire, unable to target all the American tanks simultaneously. After exchanging several rounds, a shell from one of Dan's flanking Shermans struck the Panzer's track, immobilizing it. 2 more hits to its side armor followed, igniting an internal fire. The German crew abandoned their burning vehicle, only to be cut down by machine gun fire from the American tanks. "Cease fire," Dan ordered once the threat was eliminated. "All tanks report." His platoon had scored their first kill without casualties, but Dan felt no elation, only a professional satisfaction that their training had proven effective. The burning German tank served as a grim reminder of what could happen to them if they made a mistake. They continued their advance, now more alert than ever. Reports came in over the radio of other units engaging German armor. The Battle of Aricourt was unfolding across a wide front, with American and German tank units clashing in a series of small but intense engagements. By evening, Dan's platoon had destroyed 3 Panzer IVs while suffering only minor damage to 1 Sherman. They established a defensive position for the night, rotating watch shifts while conducting essential maintenance on their vehicles. As darkness fell, Dan finally had a moment to deal with his personal discomfort. The pain in his side had intensified during the day's action, and he discreetly swallowed another antibiotic pill while checking his abdomen in the privacy of his tank. The area was inflamed and tender, but the medication seemed to be keeping the worst symptoms at bay. He knew he was gambling with his health, but with his platoon now in combat, he refused to leave them for a hospital bed. The following day brought heavier fighting. German forces had regrouped overnight and launched a counterattack supported by Panther tanks. These formidable vehicles, with their sloped armor and high-velocity 75 millimeter guns, presented a much greater threat than the Panzer IVs they had previously encountered. Dan's platoon was assigned to defend a critical crossroads against the German thrust. They positioned their Shermans in hold-down positions behind a low ridge, using the terrain to minimize their exposure while maintaining clear fields of fire. "Remember your training," Dan reminded his crews over the radio. "Panthers outgun us at range. Don't engage frontally beyond 600 yards. Aim for the Sansa rear if possible. Use your mobility. They're faster than Tigers, but still slower than us." The distant rumble of heavy engines announced the German approach. Dan scanned the valley below through his binoculars, soon spotting the distinctive silhouettes of Panther tanks advancing with infantry support. 3 Panthers, 11 o'clock. Range 200 yards, he reported. Hold fire until they close to 800. The minutes crawled by as the German tanks advanced, unaware of the American position. Dan's hands tightened on his binoculars, counting down the range. 900 yards, 850, 800. Dan gave the order. "All tanks, fire." 5 Shermans fired almost simultaneously. 2 shots missed. 2 glanced off the Panther's sloped frontal armor, but 1 struck a Panther's side armor as it began to turn, penetrating the thinner plating. The German tank shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches. The remaining Panthers immediately returned fire, their superior guns finding range quickly. A shell struck just below Dan's position, showering his tank with dirt and rocks. Another hit one of his platoon's Shermans directly, penetrating its frontal armor. The stricken tank erupted in flames, its crew bailing out under heavy fire. 4 and 5, pull back and reposition, Dan ordered, adapting to the deteriorating situation. 2, with me, we're flanking right while they're focused on our withdrawing tanks. Dan dropped down into his tank. "Driver, move out right, follow the depression until you reach that hedgerow, maximum speed." Wilson engaged the transmission, and the Sherman lurched forward, descending from their position and racing along a shallow ravine that provided momentary cover from the German tanks. Dan's plan was to use the distraction of the withdrawing tanks to maneuver into a flanking position from which they could target the Panther's vulnerable side armor. The engine roared as Wilson pushed the Sherman to its top speed, bouncing violently over the uneven ground. Inside, the crew braced themselves against the jolts while remaining focused on their duties. Dan alternated between checking their progress through his periscope and consulting his map to ensure they were following the planned route. After several tense minutes, they reached the hedgerow position. Dan ordered the tank to halt just behind the natural screen of vegetation. "Gunner, traverse right. Target should be at our 2 o'clock, approximately 500 yards. Maxwell rotated the turret smoothly. "I have visual on one Panther, sir. Side aspect. Fire when ready." The 75mm gun barked, and seconds later, Maxwell reported, "Hit, side armor, midsection." Through his periscope, Dan saw the Panther jerk as the shell struck. A small fire started near its engine compartment, but the German tank continued to function, its turret rotating to face this new threat. "Driver, reverse, get us back behind cover," Dan ordered urgently. Wilson threw the Sherman into reverse just as the Panther fired. The German shell passed through the spot they had occupied moments earlier, demonstrating the razor-thin margin between survival and destruction in tank warfare. "Loader, APCBC round," Dan called. "APCBC up," Donovan responded, slamming another armor-piercing round into the breech. "Driver, forward 5 yards. Gunner, same target. Aim for the junction between the turret and hull." The Sherman edged forward, exposing just enough of itself for Maxwell to acquire the target. Target acquired. "Fire!" The shell struck precisely where Dan had indicated, at the vulnerable ring where the Panther's turret joined the hull. The German tank's turret jerked to a stop, and moments later, hatches flew open as the crew abandoned the disabled vehicle. "Good shooting," Dan acknowledged. "Driver, pull back. Let's regroup with the platoon." When they rejoined their unit, Dan learned that one of his tanks had been destroyed with 2 crewmen killed, while another had suffered track damage but was repairable. The engagement had cost them, but they had eliminated 2 Panthers, a favorable exchange given the German tank's technical superiority. That evening, as they established defensive positions and prepared for potential night action, Dan retrieved a small, battered German stove from his personal gear. He had acquired it from an abandoned German tank weeks earlier, finding it superior to the American-issued Coleman stoves, which produced dangerous flare-ups when lit. "Starting the coffee service, Lieutenant?" Sergeant Maxwell asked with weary humor as Dan set up the stove in the relative privacy of their tank's shadow. "Thought we earned it today," Dan replied, igniting the stove's blue flame. "This German model is actually quite good. Burns cleaner than ours." "Jerry makes good equipment," Maxwell acknowledged. "Just not enough of it, thank God." As the coffee heated, Dan discreetly swallowed another antibiotic pill. The day's exertions had aggravated his appendicitis, but he couldn't show weakness now. His men needed his leadership more than ever after losing comrades for the first time. The crew gathered around the small stove, drinking coffee from their canteen cups and processing the day's events in their own ways. Some spoke quietly, others remained silent. Dan observed them carefully, noting signs of stress and fatigue. "We performed well today," he told them, his voice low but clear. "The Germans have better tanks, but we have better crews. Remember that." Private Garcia, the youngest of the crew, looked up from his coffee. "Sir, is it true that German tankers get a special badge when they destroy 5 enemy tanks?" Dan nodded. "The Tank Destruction Badge. Silver for 5 kills, gold for more." "Do we get anything like that?" "Just the satisfaction of still being alive," Dan replied with a slight smile. "And maybe a promotion if you're lucky." The men chuckled tiredly, tension easing slightly. "Get some rest," Dan advised. 2-hour watch rotations tonight. I'll take first watch." After the men had settled into their sleeping positions, Dan climbed back onto his tank, scanning the darkened landscape. The pain in his side had subsided to a dull throb, manageable for now. In the distance, occasional flares illuminated the sky, and the rumble of artillery provided a constant background soundtrack. Dan took out a small notebook and pencil, recording the day's events and casualties while they were fresh in his mind. He would need to write letters to the families of the men who had died, a commander's most solemn duty. As he wrote in the dim light of his shielded flashlight, he reflected on how quickly theory had transformed into bloody reality. The technical specifications and tactical doctrines he had studied so diligently were now matters of life and death, not just academic exercises. Their baptism by fire at Ericourt continued for several more days, with Dan's platoon engaging in numerous smaller actions against German armor and infantry. By the time the battle concluded, they had destroyed 7 enemy tanks while losing 2 of their own, a remarkable record given the technical disparity between the Sherman and its German counterparts. The experience cemented Dan's status among his men. They had entered combat as a collection of individuals. They emerged as a cohesive unit shaped by shared danger and mutual trust. Dan's calm command under fire and tactical adaptability had proven more valuable than any technical advantage the enemy possessed. Following Ericourt, the 4th Armored Division continued its advance toward the German border. Dan's platoon received replacement tanks and crews for their losses, and he worked to integrate the newcomers into their battle-tested unit. The pain of his appendicitis had stabilized into a constant but manageable discomfort that he had learned to endure, though he knew the condition remained dangerous. In late November, they received orders to proceed to Château Salins, a town near the German border, where they would join a larger force preparing for operations into German territory. As they moved through the increasingly cold French countryside, Dan sensed they were approaching another turning point in the war. The fighting would only intensify as they neared Germany itself, and winter would add new challenges to an already difficult campaign. The strange mix of professional pride in their combat success and personal grief for lost comrades weighed on Dan as they approached their destination. War was revealing itself as both simpler and more complex than he had imagined. Simpler in its brutal immediacy, more complex in its emotional aftermath. The tank commander who arrived at Château Salins was not the same man who had landed in France months earlier. He was harder, more experienced, and acutely aware that the path ahead would demand even more from him and his men. Chapter 7. Singling, the Steel Crucible. The pre-dawn darkness shrouded the small Alsatian village of Singling in a heavy mist as Lieutenant Daniel Harrington studied the terrain through his binoculars. December 6, 1944, a date that would be forever etched in his memory. Intelligence reports indicated that a significant German armored force held defensive positions around the village, including several Panther tanks dug into hull-down positions. 3rd Platoon, along with the rest of Company B, had been assigned to capture the village as part of the larger offensive pushing toward the German border. The terrain presented a formidable challenge, open, gently rolling farmland offering minimal cover for attacking tanks, with the village situated on high ground, providing excellent fields of fire for the defenders. A frontal assault would be suicidal. Dan had argued for a night approach using terrain features for concealment, but Company Commander Captain Lewis had overruled him, insisting on a dawn attack with artillery support. "Sergeant Miller," Dan called softly to his platoon sergeant who crouched nearby, "gather the tank commanders for final briefing." 5 minutes later, the sergeants commanding each of Dan's tanks huddled around a rough map drawn in the dirt. "German positions are approximately here and here." Dan indicated the likely locations of enemy tanks and anti-tank guns. "Artillery will begin at 0630, providing smoke cover along this line. We'll advance through this draw, using it for partial concealment. 2nd Platoon will move simultaneously through this sector to divide their attention." "That's still mighty exposed ground, Lieutenant," observed Sergeant Thompson, commander of the platoon's 2nd tank. "It is," Dan acknowledged, "which is why we're adjusting the standard approach. I've coordinated with Baker Company's executive officer. We've been assigned temporary operational control of their Firefly." This news drew surprised looks. The British modified Sherman Firefly, with its powerful 17-pounder gun, was a rare asset typically held in reserve for special tactical situations. "Here's my plan," Dan continued, his voice low but intense. "Standard doctrine would distribute our tanks evenly across the attack front. Instead, we'll concentrate our force. The Firefly will take position here on this small rise, providing overwatch with its superior range and penetration. Our 5 Shermans will advance in tight formation through this draw, using mutual supporting fire." "Sounds like that steel wolf pack concept you've mentioned before, sir," Sergeant Miller noted. "Similar principles," Dan confirmed. "Germans expect us to spread out. By concentrating our firepower, we create local superiority that can overwhelm their positions one by one." "What about Captain Lewis's orders?" asked Thompson. "He specified we use standard approach doctrine." Dan's expression hardened slightly. "I'll take responsibility for the tactical adjustment. Our primary objective remains capturing the village, and this gives us the best chance of doing so with minimal casualties." The sergeants exchanged glances, then nodded in agreement. They had fought alongside Dan long enough to trust his judgment, even when it deviated from standard doctrine. "Get back to your tanks and brief your crews," Dan concluded. "Radio check at 0615. Attack commences with artillery at 6:30. As the sergeants dispersed, Dan climbed back into his command tank. The inside was cold, the metal surfaces radiating the winter chill. His crew had been awake for hours, performing final checks on their equipment and ammunition. All set? Dan asked as he settled into his position. Yes, sir, Maxwell replied from the gunner's seat. Guns operating smoothly. Sights adjusted for the cold. Extra coffee in the thermos, added Donovan, patting the loader's ready rack where shells were arranged for quick access. And I've got 3 AP rounds set on my lap for faster loading when we make contact. Dan nodded approvingly. His crew had developed their own systems for maximizing efficiency in combat. Donovan's practice of keeping several shells on his lap rather than retrieving each from the rack had shaved precious seconds off their reload time in previous engagements. As the minutes ticked toward the attack time, Dan felt the familiar blend of tension and focus that preceded combat. His appendicitis pain had flared during the night, forcing him to double his antibiotic dose. The medication dulled the pain, but left him slightly lightheaded, a concerning side effect when clear thinking was essential. At precisely 6:30, the American artillery opened fire. Dozens of guns sent shells screaming overhead to impact around the village. Some fired high-explosive rounds to suppress enemy infantry, while others laid smoke screens to obscure the advancing American tanks. "Driver, advance," Dan ordered as soon as the artillery began. "All tanks, follow in formation. Maintain 20-yard intervals." The Sherman's engine roared as Wilson engaged the transmission, and the 30-ton vehicle lurched forward into the misty dawn light. The other tanks of 3rd Platoon fell in behind, maintaining their ordered spacing. Off to their right flank, 2nd Platoon began their diversionary advance. Dan stood in the commander's cupola, head exposed to maintain better visibility despite the risk from enemy fire. Through the drifting smoke and mist, he scanned for threats, occasionally ducking to check their position against his map. They had covered perhaps 500 yards when the first German response came. A high-velocity shell whistled overhead, followed by a muzzle flash from the village edge. "Panther, 11 o'clock, edge of stone wall," Dan called. "Gunner, can you see it?" "Negative, sir," Maxwell replied. "Smoke's too thick from my position." Dan made a quick decision. "Driver, halt. Radio the Firefly. Panther at grid reference J4, partially exposed behind stone wall at village edge." The Firefly commander acknowledged. And seconds later, the distinctive boom of the 17-pounder gun sounded from their left flank. The powerful shell streaked toward the German position, striking near the Panther's turret. A secondary explosion indicated an ammunition fire. "Good effect on target," Dan reported. "Driver, continue advance. All tanks, adjust course 5 degrees right." The platoon pushed forward, now moving at maximum speed to minimize their exposure in the open ground. Another German tank opened fire, this one concealed in a barn at the village entrance. Its shell struck the ground mere feet from Dan's tank, showering them with frozen earth. "Return fire," Dan ordered. "Gunner, he round, barn at village entrance, 2 o'clock. "He up," Donovan called as he slammed the high-explosive shell into the breach. "On target," Maxwell confirmed. "Fire!" The Sherman's gun barked, and the shell smashed into the barn, collapsing part of the structure. The German tank inside backed out of the ruined building, attempting to reposition. "Firefly, target moving tank at village entrance," Dan called over the radio. Again, the 17-pounder fired, and the German tank erupted in flames as the British shell penetrated its side armor. Dan's adapted tactics were working. The concentrated American firepower was overwhelming the German defenders one position at a time, while the Firefly's long-range precision fire neutralized threats before they could effectively engage the advancing Shermans. They were within 300 yards of the village when disaster struck. A previously undetected anti-tank gun opened fire from a concealed position in a stone farmhouse. Its first shell struck Dan's tank on the right front hull, the impact throwing him against the cupola ring with stunning force. "Driver hit!" Garcia shouted from the bow gunner's position. "Wilson's wounded bad." Dan dropped down into the tank, finding Wilson slumped in his seat, blood spreading across his chest where shrapnel had penetrated the hull. The driver was alive but unconscious and severely wounded. "Garcia, take over driving," Dan ordered. "I'll handle the bow gun if needed." As Garcia scrambled to move Wilson out of the driver's seat, Dan checked the tank's systems. The engine was still running, and preliminary checks showed no critical damage to their mobility or firepower. However, they were now stationary in exposed ground. A perfect target. "Sir, I can't reach the pedals properly," Garcia reported, struggling with the unfamiliar driver's position. Wilson's taller than me. Switch with me, Dan decided instantly. I'll drive, you take command. But sir, no time to argue. Make the switch now. They exchanged positions in the cramped confines of the tank, with Dan taking the driver's seat while Garcia moved up to the commander's position. It wasn't standard procedure by any measure, a lieutenant serving as driver while an enlisted man commanded, but the emergency demanded immediate action. Dan had trained on all crew positions during his time at Fort Knox, though he had seldom practiced driving since taking command. He quickly adjusted the seat, familiarizing himself with the controls. The pain in his side flared agonizingly as he contorted his body into the confined space, but he pushed the discomfort aside, focusing on the immediate crisis. All tanks, continue the advance, he ordered over the intercom, which Garcia relayed through the radio. Concentrate fire on that farmhouse, coordinates K5. Dan engaged the transmission and guided the damaged Sherman forward, rejoining the advance while simultaneously monitoring Wilson's condition. The wounded driver had been secured as best they could manage in the limited space, but he needed medical attention soon. The platoon's combined firepower silenced the anti-tank gun, and they pushed into the village outskirts, engaging German infantry with their machine guns, while the main guns targeted hardened positions. The fighting became close quarters and chaotic as they maneuvered through narrow streets, using buildings for cover. Throughout the engagement, Dan maintained exceptional situational awareness despite his unusual position, calling out targets and maneuvering the tank with surprising skill. His mathematical mind calculated angles and distances instinctively, allowing him to position the Sherman optimally for Maxwell's gunnery. After nearly 2 hours of intense fighting, they secured the village center. German resistance crumbled as surviving enemy forces retreated toward their secondary defensive line. 3rd Platoon had captured their objective while destroying 3 German tanks and multiple anti-tank positions. The cost had been significant. Wilson was gravely wounded, another of their tanks had been knocked out with 2 casualties, and several crew members had suffered minor injuries. Dan's tank had taken multiple hits but remained operational, a testament to the Sherman's rugged construction. As they established defensive positions in the captured village, medics evacuated Wilson to a field hospital. Dan finally had a moment to address his own condition. The exertion and stress of combat had worsened his appendicitis significantly. His abdomen was rigid and extremely tender, classic signs of potential rupture. The antibiotics were no longer controlling the infection adequately. Despite his deteriorating condition, Dan prioritized securing the position and checking on his men before seeking medical attention. He personally inspected each tank, assessing damage and commending his crews for their performance. "Lieutenant, you look like hell," Sergeant Miller commented bluntly when they met to coordinate defensive positions. "You're pale as a ghost." "Just tired," Dan deflected, though he knew it was more serious. "How's ammunition status?" "We're at about 50% across the platoon. Resupply convoy is due within the hour." "Good. Rotate the crews for hot meals and maintenance checks. I want—" Dan stopped mid-sentence as a wave of pain doubled him over. Miller caught him before he could fall. "Sir, what's wrong?" "Nothing, just a cramp." Dan tried to straighten, but the pain was overwhelming. "Bullshit," Miller retorted. "You're sick. How long has this been going on?" Dan hesitated, then admitted the truth. "Appendicitis. Started in England before the invasion." Miller's eyes widened. "Jesus Christ, sir. That's months ago. You've been fighting with appendicitis this whole time?" "Managed it with antibiotics," Dan explained through gritted teeth. "Didn't want to leave the platoon." "That's the stupidest, brave thing I've ever heard," Miller said, shaking his head. "I'm getting a medic, and you're not arguing." Within an hour, Dan was evacuated to the same field hospital where Wilson had been taken. The diagnosis was grim. His appendix was on the verge of rupturing, requiring immediate surgery. As he was being prepared for the operation, the battalion commander, Colonel Wilson, arrived unexpectedly. "Quite a stunt you pulled today, Lieutenant," the colonel said, standing beside Dan's gurney. "Modifying standard tactics without authorization, then driving your own tank while wounded." Dan tried to sit up straighter despite the pain. "Sir, I take full responsibility for deviating from orders. I believe the tactical adjustment was necessary given the terrain and enemy positions." Wilson's stern expression softened slightly. "You were right. Initial reports indicate your platoon neutralized more enemy armor, with fewer casualties than the other units using standard approach doctrine. The Firefly integration was particularly effective." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. There will still be questions about your decision to disregard direct orders. Wilson paused. And about your failure to report a serious medical condition that could have compromised your command effectiveness. Dan nodded, accepting the criticism. Yes, sir. That said, Wilson continued, the results speak for themselves. Once you're recovered, assuming you survive this surgery, we'll discuss implementing your Steel Wolf Pack tactics on a wider scale. Your after-action report better be comprehensive. It will be, sir. Wilson turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing, Harrington, your driver, Private Wilson. He'll make it. Serious injuries, but the surgeons are optimistic. Relief washed over Dan. Thank you for telling me, sir. As the medical staff prepared to administer anesthesia, Dan reflected on the Battle of Singling. They had achieved their objective and validated his tactical theories, but at significant cost. The true test of leadership wasn't just winning engagements, but preserving the lives of those under his command. As darkness closed in, he promised himself to be more careful with both his men's lives and his own, assuming he survived the surgery. Chapter 8. Bastogne, Ice, and Fire. The military hospital near Metz hummed with activity as nurses and doctors moved efficiently between rows of wounded soldiers. Lieutenant Daniel Harrington sat on the edge of his bed, carefully buttoning his uniform jacket, despite the pain that still lingered from his recent appendectomy. After 2 weeks of recovery, he had finally received medical clearance to return to his unit, just in time for Christmas, if the calendar on the wall was accurate. You're looking better, Lieutenant, observed the ward nurse as she approached with discharge papers. Still, you should take it easy for another week. No heavy lifting. Dan smiled politely. I'll do my best, ma'am, but tank commanders don't have much control over their working conditions. So I've gathered from your restlessness, she replied with a professional concern. Your surgeon wants me to remind you that you're still healing internally. The infection was severe. Another few days and you might not have made it. I appreciate the care I've received, Dan said sincerely. Has there been any word about Private Wilson? He was brought in the same day as me. The driver from your crew? He stabilized and was evacuated to England yesterday. His injuries will need specialized treatment, but the prognosis is good for eventual recovery. The news eased one of Dan's primary concerns. Wilson had saved countless lives with his skilled driving over months of combat, and the thought of losing him had weighed heavily on Dan's mind. After completing the discharge formalities, Dan caught a ride on a supply truck heading toward the front. The December landscape passed by in a blur of bare trees and occasional snow-covered fields. The weather had turned bitterly cold, presaging a harsh winter campaign. During his hospital stay, Dan had received regular updates on the war situation from visiting officers and radio reports. His platoon had been involved in several small actions near the German border, sustaining minor casualties but generally maintaining their effectiveness. Sergeant Miller had assumed temporary command in Dan's absence, with Maxwell taking over Dan's tank. As the truck approached the divisional headquarters area, Dan noticed an unusual level of activity. Vehicles moving in convoys, staff officers rushing between command tents, an atmosphere of urgent mobilization rather than routine operations. Something big happening? He asked the driver. You haven't heard, the driver replied, surprised. Germans launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes 6 days ago. Broke through our lines. They're calling it the Battle of the Bulge now because of the shape of the salient on the maps. Dan's interest sharpened immediately. How bad is it? Bad enough. Jerry caught us with our pants down. Weather's been too poor for air support. Word is they've got entire panzer divisions involved, maybe even SS units. Bastogne is surrounded. 101st Airborne is holding it, but they need relief. The news was sobering. After months of steady advance, the Allies were suddenly on the defensive, facing a desperate German gamble to split their forces and potentially change the war's momentum. When Dan reached his unit's position, he found them in the midst of intensive preparation. Tanks were being refueled and rearmed, extra rations and ammunition loaded, maintenance conducted with urgent efficiency. Sergeant Miller spotted him approaching and hurried over, surprise evident on his weathered face. Lieutenant, didn't expect to see you back so soon. Heard there was a party starting without me, Dan replied with grim humor, shaking Miller's hand. What's our status? Miller quickly brought him up to speed. Orders came down an hour ago. The entire division is moving north to relieve Bastogne. We've been assigned to Combat Command Reserve. Full combat load, 5 days rations, extra fuel and ammo. Moving out at 1800 hours. Dan nodded, processing the information. Casualties while I was gone? Minor. Lost Jennings to a sniper 2 days ago. He'll recover, but he's been evacuated. Simmons from 4th Tank has trench foot. Medical's keeping him. We've got replacements for both, plus a new driver for your tank, Corporal Taylor. Good man, experienced. The tanks, 5 operational, 2 required track replacement, 1 got a new transmission, but they're all combat ready now. Extra maintenance before this push. Dan looked over the bustling motor pool. Winter equipment? Miller's expression soured slightly. That's a sore point. Winter clothing is in short supply. We've got standard issue only. No specialized cold weather gear. The tanks have their standard winterization kits, antifreeze mixtures adjusted for the temperature, but that's it. The lack of proper winter equipment was concerning, especially with reports indicating the worst December weather in years. Tank operations in deep snow and extreme cold presented unique challenges. Decreased mobility, increased mechanical failures, and heightened crew discomfort that could impair performance. I better report to the CO, Dan said. Then I want to inspect each tank personally before we move out. Captain Lewis was surprised but visibly relieved to see Dan. Harrington, medical said you wouldn't be back for another week. Negotiated an early release, sir, Dan replied, not mentioning that he had essentially pressured the doctors into signing his discharge papers. Couldn't miss the excitement. Lewis's expression turned serious. It's going to be rough. The Germans have committed significant forces to this offensive, including their best remaining armored divisions. Intelligence suggests elements of the 2nd Panzer Division are directly in our path, equipped with Panthers and possibly some Tigers. Any updates to our tactical approach based on recent engagements? Actually, yes. Lewis reached for a folder on his desk. Your after-action report from Singling made it up to division. They were impressed with the results of your Steel Wolf Pack concept, especially the Firefly integration. Colonel Wilson has authorized experimental implementation for this operation. Dan couldn't hide his surprise. His unauthorized tactical adjustment had apparently impressed the higher command enough to warrant official adoption. We've been allocated 2 Fireflies for our company, Lewis continued. 1 will be attached to your platoon specifically, with the understanding that you'll demonstrate the effectiveness of your tactical approach under winter combat conditions. Thank you for the confidence, sir. Don't thank me. This came straight from Colonel Wilson. He seems to think you've got something valuable to contribute to our armored doctrine. Lewis handed Dan a set of orders. Familiarize yourself with the road. We're taking secondary roads to avoid German air reconnaissance. Weather forecast is grim. Snow, limited visibility, temperatures well below freezing. After the briefing, Dan spent the remaining hours before departure inspecting his platoon's vehicles and reuniting with his crew. They welcomed him back with genuine warmth, having worried about his condition after his evacuation. Good to have you back, sir, Maxwell said, speaking for the crew. Things weren't the same without you. Dan introduced himself to Corporal Taylor, his new driver, a stocky Midwesterner with 2 years of tank experience. I understand you've been briefed on our tactical approach? Yes, sir, Taylor confirmed. Sergeant Miller explained your preferred maneuver patterns and coordination techniques. I've been practicing with the crew for the past week. Satisfied with the preparations, Dan focused on the most pressing concern, the bitter cold they would face during the operation. He instructed his crews to install every available insulation material in their tanks, from extra blankets to cardboard scavenged from ration boxes. Small adjustments could make significant differences in crew comfort and effectiveness during extended winter operations. At precisely 1800 hours, the order came to move out. Dan's platoon joined the massive column of vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and jeeps, streaming northward toward the embattled Ardennes. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted, metal surfaces inside the tanks becoming painfully cold to touch without gloves. The convoy traveled through the night, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. Progress was slow on the icy secondary roads, with occasional halts to address mechanical issues or navigate difficult terrain. Inside Dan's tank, the crew rotated watch duties, each man taking turns at the commander's cupola to give the others a chance to warm up in the marginally warmer interior. Dawn broke on a landscape transformed by fresh snowfall, eerily beautiful yet treacherous for military operations. Visibility was limited by drifting snow and low clouds that grounded Allied air support, a significant disadvantage given their typical air superiority. By mid-afternoon, they approached the outer defensive perimeter established by German forces around Bastogne. Reports from forward reconnaissance indicated scattered German armored units guarding key road junctions, with the main force concentrated to the north. Dan's platoon, along with the rest of Company B, was assigned to secure a critical crossroads that would open an access route to the surrounded American forces in Bastogne. As they neared the objective, Dan ordered his tanks into their modified steel wolf pack formation, with the attached Firefly positioned on a small rise to provide overwatch, while the 5 standard Shermans advanced in coordinated groups. The first contact came as they approached a small frozen stream that bisected the rolling terrain. A German reconnaissance unit spotted their advance and fired signal flares, alerting the main defensive force. Within minutes, the distinct silhouettes of Panzer IVs and at least one Panther appeared along the tree line beyond the stream. "All tanks deploy as briefed," Dan ordered over the radio. "Firefly, take position at grid reference H3. Target that Panther first." His platoon executed the maneuver smoothly, spreading out to present multiple targets while maintaining mutual supporting positions. The Firefly crew, British tankers temporarily attached to their unit, demonstrated their professionalism by quickly taking up the designated overwatch position. The German tanks opened fire first, their shells kicking up plumes of snow as they bracketed the American positions. Dan ordered his tanks to hold fire until optimal range, using the intervening time to coordinate targeting priorities. "Firefly, you are clear to engage the Panther," Dan radioed when all units were in position. The powerful 17-pounder gun roared, its shells streaking across the battlefield to strike the Panther's turret face. Even the formidable German armor couldn't withstand a direct hit from the high-velocity round at that range. The Panther's turret jerked violently, and smoke began pouring from the hatches. With the primary threat neutralized, Dan's Sherman platoon opened fire on the remaining German vehicles. The coordinated volley caught the Germans by surprise, accustomed as they were to facing dispersed American tanks firing individually. 2 Panzer IVs were hit in a rapid succession, while a third managed to withdraw into the cover of the forest. "Advance to the streamline," Dan ordered. "Maintain formation integrity." As they pushed forward, the bone-chilling cold became as much an enemy as the German forces. Metal surfaces inside the tanks conducted the bitter temperature, making every control and surface painful to touch without gloves. Visibility was further reduced by the frosting of vision blocks and periscopes, requiring frequent clearing. They crossed the frozen stream, ice cracking ominously beneath their treads, but holding the weight of the 30-ton vehicles. The German resistance intensified as they approached the crossroads, with concealed anti-tank guns and infantry armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets joining the fight. "Infantry on our flanks," called Sergeant Thompson's tank. "Request permission to use canister rounds." "Granted," Dan replied. "All tanks be alert for infantry close assault. Maintain intervals." The battle devolved into a chaotic melee of tanks, anti-tank guns, and infantry fighting at close quarters in the snow-covered terrain. Dan's steel wolfpack tactics proved their worth as the concentrated American firepower overwhelmed the German defenses sector by sector rather than engaging across a broad front. By nightfall, they had secured the crossroads, but at a cost. One Sherman had been destroyed by a direct hit from an anti-tank gun, with 3 crewmen killed. Another had thrown a track in the difficult terrain and was undergoing emergency repairs. The human toll was compounded by the environmental challenges. Several men were showing early signs of frostbite despite rotating positions to share the marginally warmer spots inside the tanks. As darkness settled, the temperature dropped even further. Dan ordered his remaining operational tanks into a defensive perimeter around the crossroads, with crews rotating between combat readiness and warming in the small fire they established in a partially destroyed building nearby. "Hell of a Christmas Eve," Maxwell commented as they huddled around the meager fire during their off-watch period. Dan glanced up, having lost track of the date and the intensity of combat operations. "Is it the 24th already?" "Yes, sir. Time for peace on earth and goodwill toward men," Maxwell replied with bitter irony, gesturing toward the distant sound of artillery. Dan managed a weary smile. "Maybe next year." As if responding to the conversation, the German artillery began a bombardment of their position, an unwelcome Christmas Eve greeting. The men rushed back to their tanks, seeking shelter from the exploding shells that sent deadly fragments and ice shards flying across the crossroads. Dan had just reached his tank when the distinct shriek of aircraft engines cut through the night. German fighters conducting a rare night strafing run, Illumination flares dropped by the aircraft turned night to day, exposing their positions as cannon fire stitched across the snow. "Button up," Dan ordered over the radio. "Use machine guns against low-level passes." The combined artillery and air attack lasted nearly an hour, a demonstration of desperate German determination to reclaim the critical crossroads. Throughout the barrage, Dan maintained communication with his platoon, keeping morale steady with his calm command presence, despite the frightening intensity of the attack. When the bombardment finally ceased, they emerged to assess the damage. Miraculously, none of their remaining tanks had been destroyed, though all showed varying degrees of damage from shell fragments and aircraft cannon fire. Several men had sustained minor injuries but remained combat effective. The remainder of Christmas Eve passed in tense vigilance, with occasional artillery exchanges but no renewed ground assault. Dan used the German field stove he had salvaged months earlier to heat coffee for his crew, a small comfort in the brutal conditions. The tiny blue flame provided both practical benefit and a psychological lift, a reminder of human ingenuity amid inhuman circumstances. As midnight approached, Dan stood watch at his tank's cupola, scanning the darkened battlefield, while most of his crew snatched brief periods of rest below. The stars emerged as clouds temporarily cleared, casting cold light over the snow-covered landscape. The temperature had fallen to well below freezing, causing every metal surface to conduct painful cold. In this moment of relative quiet, Dan's thoughts turned to memories of holidays before the war, his family's traditions in Poland, the Hanukkah celebrations of his childhood. He wondered, as he often did during such reflections, whether any of his family had survived the German occupation. The personal stake in this war, which had initially driven him to join the American military, remained a powerful motivation through every hardship. His contemplation was interrupted by the crackle of the radio. "All units able 6, came the voice of the battalion commander. "Status report." Dan provided a concise update on his platoon's condition and position, noting their readiness to continue operations despite the challenging conditions. "Understood, Baker 3, the commander replied. "Be advised, major enemy armored thrust expected at dawn. Intelligence indicates elements of 2nd SS Panzer Division moving into your sector. Reinforcements en route, but may not arrive before initial contact. Hold position at all costs." "Acknowledged, Able 6. We'll hold." Dan passed the information to his platoon sergeants, ordering increased vigilance and finalizing defensive arrangements for the anticipated assault. The SS Panzer units represented the elite of German armored forces, typically equipped with the best available tanks and manned by fanatically committed crews. As Christmas Day dawned with leaden skies promising more snow, Dan gathered his tank commanders for a final coordination meeting. Their breath formed dense clouds in the frigid air as they huddled over maps spread on the engine deck of his Sherman, which had been run briefly to provide some warmth. "We face superior armor and possibly superior numbers," Dan stated plainly, "but we have several advantages: defensive position, knowledge of the terrain, and our concentrated firepower tactics. The Firefly will engage from maximum range, targeting Tigers and Panthers first. Our Shermans will operate in coordinated pairs, using terrain features for hull-down positions." He outlined specific sectors of responsibility and fallback positions if the initial defense was breached. "Remember, we're buying time for reinforcements. Every minute we hold is another minute closer to relief." The men nodded grimly, understanding the stakes. Their stand at this crossroads could determine whether the surrounded forces in Bastogne received the support they desperately needed. As they returned to their tanks, Dan heard the distant rumble of heavy engines, the unmistakable sound of German armor approaching. The Battle of the Bulge had reached its climax, and 3rd Platoon stood directly in the path of the German advance. Christmas Day would be marked not by celebration, but by one of the most critical tank engagements of their combat experience. A battle fought in conditions so severe that man and machine were tested to their absolute limits. The snow began falling again as Dan climbed into his commander's position, the white flakes stark against his dark uniform. Below him, his crew prepared for combat, Maxwell checking his gun sight, Donovan arranging shells for rapid access, Taylor warming the engine to ensure optimal performance in the bitter cold. Dan surveyed the battlefield one final time before the storm reduced visibility further. This frozen crossroads in the Ardennes was far from where he had imagined fighting when he joined the army, but the principle remained the same: stopping the German war machine that had consumed his homeland and family. As the enemy armor approached through the swirling snow, Lieutenant Daniel Harrington stood ready, determined that his steel wolf pack would hold the line no matter the cost. The German winter offensive had reached its zenith by early January 1945. The desperate gamble that had caught the Allies by surprise was now faltering against stiffening resistance and critical fuel shortages. Lieutenant Daniel Harrington's 3rd Platoon had survived the brutal Christmas battle at the Bastogne crossroads, holding their position until reinforcements arrived. Their stand had contributed to the larger Allied effort that ultimately broke the German advance, transforming the Battle of the Bulge from potential disaster to hard-won victory. Now, as January's bitter cold gripped the Ardennes forests, the 4th Armored Division had shifted from desperate defense to cautious offense, reclaiming territory lost during the initial German thrust. 3rd Platoon had received replacement tanks and crews for their losses, and despite the continuing hardships of winter warfare, morale had improved with the knowledge that they had weathered the worst the Germans could throw at them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered fields as Dan's platoon advanced along a narrow country road. Intelligence reports indicated scattered German units in the area, attempting to establish a defensive line to cover their broader withdrawal. Their mission was to probe these defenses, identify weak points, and exploit any opportunity to push eastward toward the German border. Dan stood in his commander's cupola, scanning the terrain through binoculars despite the biting cold. His breath formed dense clouds in the frigid air as he studied the tree line ahead, looking for signs of enemy activity. All tanks maintain interval, he instructed over the radio. Gunners watch the eastern tree line and that farmhouse complex ahead. The farmstead in question sat atop a small rise, offering excellent fields of fire across the open ground they would need to cross. Perfect defensive position, which made it a prime candidate for German occupation. "Sir," called Maxwell from the gunner's position below. "Movement at the farmhouse, vehicle of some kind." Dan refocused his binoculars on the distant buildings. A military vehicle had emerged from behind the main structure, its profile unmistakable, even at this distance. "Sherman tank," Dan announced with surprise, moving from the farmhouse toward the eastern road. "Friendly unit?" asked Sergeant Miller over the radio from his tank. Dan continued observing, something triggering his suspicion. Possibly. No clear identification visible. He keyed his radio to the company frequency. "Baker 6, this is Baker 3. Be advised, Sherman tank observed vicinity grid K7 moving eastward. Any friendly units reported in that sector?" "Negative, Baker 3, came the immediate response. "No friendly armor deployed forward of your position. Proceed with caution." Dan studied the distant tank more carefully. It moved with purpose along the farm road, but something about its appearance struck him as wrong. After months of combat, he had developed an almost instinctive recognition of Allied vehicles and their typical configurations. This Sherman had subtle differences, its silhouette slightly altered, its movement patterns unusual. Then he noticed it, a flash of darker paint visible on the turret where snow had partially fallen away. A German cross. "All tanks target that Sherman," Dan ordered sharply. "It's German, captured and repurposed." The Germans had occasionally used captured Allied vehicles for reconnaissance or ambush operations, typically adding their own markings. This particular tactic was especially treacherous, as it exploited the natural hesitation Allied forces would feel before firing on what appeared to be a friendly tank. "Confirm hostile, sir?" Maxwell asked, seeking absolute verification before engaging. "Confirmed. German markings partially visible on turret. Engagement authorized." Dan's mind raced, analyzing the tactical situation. They had the element of surprise. The German crew likely believed their disguise was still effective. Rather than immediately opening fire, he formulated a more comprehensive approach. "All tanks hold position and prepare to engage," he instructed. "Tanks 1 and 2, establish overwatch from current position. 3 and 4, maneuver left to establish crossfire position. 5, with me, will create a diversion to flush them into the open." The platoon acknowledged, executing the coordinated movement that had become their hallmark. Dan's tank, accompanied by Tank 5, advanced at an angle that would appear to the Germans as routine movement rather than a deliberate attack approach. "Driver, maintain steady speed," Dan instructed Taylor. "Make it look like normal patrol movement. Gunner, prepare ape round, but hold fire until my command." "AP loaded and ready," Maxwell confirmed, his voice steady with the calm precision that had made him one of the most effective gunners in the company. They closed to within 800 yards of the disguised German tank, which continued moving along the farm road, apparently unaware of the developing trap. Dan waited until his flanking tanks had reached their positions, creating a perfect crossfire scenario. "All tanks on my command," Dan said quietly into his radio. "3, 2, 1, engage." 5 American tanks fired nearly simultaneously, their 75mm shells converging on the disguised Sherman. Maxwell's aim proved devastatingly accurate, his round striking precisely at the junction between the turret and hull, a vulnerable point where the armor was thinnest. 4 other shells impacted within seconds, transforming the German-operated Sherman into a blazing funeral pyre. "Target destroyed," Dan confirmed, watching through his binoculars as the German crew attempted to escape the burning vehicle. None made it out alive. "All tanks advance on the farmhouse complex, maintain dispersed formation." As they approached the farm buildings, they discovered additional evidence of German deception. The barn contained maintenance equipment specifically designed to modify captured vehicles for use in false flag operations. Documents recovered from the farmhouse indicated this had been a forward base for a special German unit tasked with infiltrating Allied lines using captured equipment. "Clever approach," Captain Lewis commented when he arrived to inspect the site. "Using our own tanks against us." "Desperate tactics," Dan replied. "Shows they're running short on both equipment and conventional options." "How did you spot it so quickly?" "Small details," Dan explained. "The antenna configuration was wrong, and the movement pattern wasn't consistent with our standard patrol procedures. Then I caught a glimpse of their markings through a gap in the snow camouflage." That evening, Dan received orders to report to battalion headquarters. Colonel Wilson had established his command post in the village's small mayor's office, maps covering every available surface. "Lieutenant Harrington," Wilson greeted him as he entered. "Good work identifying that German ruse today. Intelligence is quite interested in the materials you recovered." "Thank you, sir." Wilson gestured to a detailed map of the region. "We're adjusting our operational plans based on your findings. It appears the Germans are using these disguised units to scout for a potential counter-thrust along this axis." His finger traced a line across the map. "Your platoon's action today may have preempted another local offensive." Dan studied the map, noting the strategic implications of the German preparations. "They seem to be focusing on road junctions and fuel depots, sir." "Precisely. Fuel remains their critical weakness." Wilson straightened up. "I've recommended you for the Silver Star for your actions during the Bastogne operation. Your platoon's stand at that crossroads was instrumental in maintaining our supply line to the surrounded forces." "The men deserve the recognition, sir. They performed exceptionally under extreme conditions." "They did," Wilson agreed. "But leadership matters, Lieutenant. Your tactical adaptations and command decisions made the difference between holding and breaking." He paused, his expression becoming more somber. "There's another matter I wanted to discuss with you." "Sir?" Wilson picked up a folder from his desk. "During the action at the crossroads, your platoon identified and neutralized elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, including several officers." He removed a document from the folder. "Intelligence has been processing captured materials. They found this among an SS officer's personal effects." He handed Dan a slightly crumpled photograph. It showed a Jewish family standing in front of a small shop with Hebrew lettering above the door. With a shock, Dan recognized his own family, his parents and sister, in front of his father's watch repair shop in Warsaw. "Where was this found?" Dan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "On the body of an SS Obersturmführer. The reverse side has notations." Wilson turned the photo over, revealing handwritten German text. "It appears this officer was previously assigned to Warsaw ghetto liquidation operations before being transferred to combat duties." Dan stared at the photograph, emotions crashing through him like artillery shells. Hope that his family might have survived if the SS had kept records of them. Horror at the implication of why an SS officer would possess such a photo. Rage at the clinical German notation describing his family. "Intelligence believes this may help locate records about your family's fate," Wilson continued gently. "When the war concludes, more thorough investigations will be possible. I thought you should have this now." Dan carefully placed the photograph in his breast pocket, his hand trembling slightly. "Thank you, sir. This means a great deal." Wilson studied him with concern. "Are you all right to continue command, Lieutenant?" Dan straightened his posture, forcing his professional demeanor back into place. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." "Good, because we need your platoon for a special operation tomorrow. Intelligence indicates a group of American POWs is being held at a small collection point near Clairvaux, about 15 miles east of our current position. With the German withdrawal, there's concern they might be relocated deeper into Germany or worse, eliminated to prevent liberation. "My platoon is ready, sir." That night, alone in his tank, Dan removed the photograph from his pocket. In the dim light of his shielded flashlight, he studied the faces of his family, his father standing proud in front of his shop, his mother with her gentle smile, his sister just entering her teens. The image had been taken in 1937 before the dark clouds had fully gathered over Europe. He turned the photo over, forcing himself to read the German notation. His German was fluent enough to understand the bureaucratic terminology that disguised the horrors it described. Horowitz family, Warsaw Sector 4, relocated October 1942. Relocated was the clinical term the Germans used for deportation to death camps. The date matched the major Warsaw Ghetto deportations to Treblinka. The cold probability was that his family had perished there, among thousands of others. Yet some tiny hope remained. The notation was vague, and occasional reports had emerged of Jews who had escaped deportation or survived the camps. Dan carefully returned the photograph to his pocket, beside his American citizenship papers. The juxtaposition was not lost on him. His new identity and lost past carried together over his heart as he fought across Europe. Tomorrow's mission to liberate American POWs took on additional meaning. It was the kind of rescue that had come too late for his own family. Before dawn, Dan gathered his platoon for final briefing. The tank crews and attached infantry stood in a close circle, breath fogging in the pre-dawn chill, as he outlined the mission parameters using a map sketched in the frozen earth. "Speed and surprise are critical," he emphasized. "German forces in the area are disorganized but still dangerous. We'll approach from the west, using this valley to mask our movement until the final kilometer. Infantry will dismount here, advance on foot to secure the perimeter while we provide covering fire from these positions." The men nodded, understanding the high stakes of the rescue operation. Dan had selected his most experienced crew for his tank, which would lead the assault. Maxwell would man the gun, Donovan would load, and Taylor would drive. The fifth position, normally Wilson's bowgunner seat, would be filled by Sergeant Ramirez, an infantry veteran temporarily attached for this operation. As gray light seeped into the eastern sky, the 5 Sherman tanks with infantry clinging to their hulls moved out, engines muted to reduce detection range. A light fog hugged the ground, providing additional concealment as they advanced through the rolling terrain. Dan stood in his commander's cupola, navigating by compass in the occasional glimpse of landmarks through the mist. They encountered no resistance during the approach, a testament to the German confusion following their failed offensive. When they reached the designated infantry dismount point, the soldiers slipped off the tanks and formed up for their advance on foot. "All tanks, establish support positions as briefed," Dan ordered. "Infantry moving forward. Maintain radio discipline." Through his binoculars, Dan watched the American infantry advance cautiously toward the old monastery complex. The stone building stood silent in the morning mist, showing no immediate signs of defensive preparations. Either intelligence had been accurate about the light German presence, or they were moving into a well-disguised trap. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness as the infantry approached the outer walls. Then came the first shots, sporadic small arms fire from several windows. The American soldiers took cover and returned fire, focusing on the visible German positions. "Gunner, target the eastern guard tower," Dan instructed Maxwell. "He round." "He loaded," Donovan confirmed. "On target," Maxwell reported, sighting through his periscope. "Fire." The Sherman's 75mm gun roared, sending a high explosive shell crashing into the stone tower. The structure partially collapsed, eliminating one of the primary German defensive positions. The other American tanks joined the bombardment, systematically reducing the outer defenses while being careful to avoid the main building where the prisoners were likely held. The infantry used this supporting fire to advance closer, eventually breaching the outer courtyard. The German resistance began to crumble, clearly a small holding force rather than a prepared defensive position. "Baker 3, this is infantry actual," came a radio call from the infantry commander. "Outer perimeter secured. Moving into main building. Request tank support at main gate to cover potential counterattack." "Understood, infantry actual. Moving forward now." Dan ordered his tank forward to the monastery gates, positioning it to guard against any German reinforcements that might approach. The remaining tanks established a defensive perimeter around the complex. 20 tense minutes later, American soldiers began emerging from the main building, escorting dozens of ragged, emaciated POWs. The prisoners blinked in the morning light, some crying openly at the sight of American tanks and the realization that their ordeal was ending. As they prepared to depart, one of the liberated officers approached Dan's tank. "Lieutenant, we need to show you something before we leave." Dan followed the man back into the monastery, through dark corridors to a small chamber that had apparently served as the German commandant's office. Inside, they found filing cabinets filled with documentation. "We overheard the guards discussing these," the officer explained. "They contain transfer records for prisoners throughout this region, not just military POWs, but civilian detainees as well, including some from concentration camps being evacuated ahead of the Soviet advance." Dan's heartbeat quickened. "Were they planning to destroy these?" "Yes, but your attack came before they could complete the task. They burned some files, but most remain intact." Dan made a swift decision. "We're taking these with us. They could be critical intelligence and might help locate other prisoners or identify victims." He didn't verbalize his personal hope that these records might contain information about deportees from Warsaw, possibly including his family. It was a long shot, but one worth taking. 3 days later, Dan received a message to report to the Division Intelligence Section. His heart raced as he made his way to the requisition school building where intelligence had established their operations. A major he didn't recognize greeted him in a room filled with captured German documents spread across multiple tables. "Lieutenant Harrington, thank you for coming. I understand you have a personal interest in some of the materials recovered during your recent operation." "Yes, sir. My family was in Warsaw when the Germans invaded. They were Jewish. I've had no information about their fate since 1942. The major nodded sympathetically. "We've been processing the documents your team recovered. Most relate to military POWs, but we found a section referring to civilian transfers from various Eastern territories, including Poland." He led Dan to a table where several folders lay open. "These are transport manifests from late 1942 through 1943. They document movements between various facilities." He spoke the euphemism with distaste, both men knowing what these facilities truly were. "Have you found anything about the Horowitz family from Warsaw?" Dan asked, barely able to form the question. "We found a David Horowitz listed in a manifest from October 1942, from Warsaw to Treblinka." The major paused. "I understand that was your birth name." "Yes," Dan acknowledged, "but I left Warsaw in 1938. It must be another David Horowitz." "That seems likely. The age listed is 47, which I assume doesn't match your father?" "My father was 42 in 1942, Dan confirmed, a chill running through him at how close the identification had been. The major continued gently. "We haven't found specific records for your parents or sister by name. However, these documents are incomplete, just fragments of the larger Nazi record-keeping system. More comprehensive records may emerge as we advance further into German territory." Dan nodded, both disappointed and somehow relieved. The absence of their names didn't confirm their fate either way. It simply prolonged the uncertainty he had lived with for years. Chapter 10. The Road to Germany. The ancient Rhine River had served as Germany's natural defensive barrier for centuries, a liquid boundary separating the German heartland from its western neighbors. By March 1945, Allied forces had reached this historic frontier along a broad front, preparing for the final push into Nazi Germany itself. The 4th Armored Division, including Lieutenant Daniel Harrington's 3rd Platoon, had advanced to the western bank near Oppenheim, midway between Mainz and Mannheim. Dan stood on a bluff overlooking the wide river, studying the opposite shore through his binoculars. Despite several months of hard fighting since the Battle of the Bulge, he maintained the alert posture and keen observational skills that had kept him and most of his men alive through countless engagements. "Doesn't look heavily defended," remarked Sergeant Miller, who stood beside him. "Not like the propaganda claimed." "The obvious defenses are minimal," Dan agreed, "but that doesn't mean they're not waiting for us. The Germans have become experts at camouflage and deception." After the brutal winter campaign, spring had arrived, bringing warmer temperatures and improved conditions for military operations. The snow had melted, leaving behind muddy terrain that still challenged vehicle movement, but no longer imposed the extreme hardships of January and February. Captain Lewis joined them at the observation point, carrying the latest operational orders. "Quite a sight, isn't it? The Rhine, we're looking at actual German soil now." "Yes, sir," Dan replied, his thoughts momentarily drifting to the personal significance of entering the nation that had destroyed his homeland and likely his family. "Have the crossing plans been finalized?" "They have. We're crossing tomorrow night at 2200 hours here at Oppenheim. Engineers will bring pontoon bridges forward under darkness. We'll be the third company across following the initial infantry assault. Lewis spread a map between them, pointing out key features. Intelligence indicates the Germans have withdrawn most of their heavy forces to more defensible terrain 10 kilometers east of the river. They're leaving behind small delaying forces and extensive minefields. Our mission is to establish a bridgehead, then push inland to create space for the follow-on forces. That evening, Dan briefed his platoon on the upcoming operation, emphasizing the need for rapid movement once they crossed the Rhine. The men listened attentively, seasoned veterans who understood the historical significance of invading Germany itself. Once we're across, we'll be in the German homeland, Dan concluded. Expect fanatical resistance from some units, especially SS, while others may surrender more readily as they see the inevitable outcome. Stay alert, maintain disciplined fire control, and remember your training. As the men dispersed to their preparations, Maxwell remained behind. Permission to speak freely, sir? Always, Sergeant. The men have been talking. They know about your background, that you're Jewish from Poland originally. They're wondering how you feel about finally entering Germany. Dan considered his response carefully. Professionally, it's the next phase of our mission, no different than crossing into any other territory. Personally, he paused. It's complicated. The Germany we're invading isn't just a Nazi regime, but a nation of civilians who either supported Hitler or failed to stop him. I don't hate ordinary Germans, but I do believe in accountability. Fair enough, sir. The men respect how you've kept personal feelings from interfering with command decisions. Some wondered if that might change once we cross the Rhine. They can rest assured it won't, Dan stated firmly. We follow the rules of war regardless of our personal feelings. That's what separates us from the enemy. The next day passed in final preparations for the crossing. Engineers moved pontoon bridge sections toward the riverside under camouflage netting. Artillery units established firing positions. Infantry platoons prepared assault boats for the initial crossing. As darkness fell, Dan's platoon moved their tanks into concealed positions near the riverbank, engines warmed and ready but silent to maintain surprise. The night was clear, with a quarter moon providing minimal illumination. Enough to see by with night-adjusted vision, but not so bright as to clearly expose the crossing forces to German observation. At precisely 2200 hours, the operation commenced with a thunderous artillery barrage targeting the opposite shore. Hundreds of guns fired simultaneously, creating a rolling wall of explosions that shattered the night's quiet and illuminated the landscape in strobing flashes. Under this covering fire, the first infantry units pushed off in assault boats, beginning the dangerous journey across the dark river. Dan watched from his tank commander's position, outwardly calm, but inwardly tense. River crossings were among the most vulnerable military operations, with crossing forces exposed and concentrated. The initial waves appeared to be meeting minimal resistance, a good sign that the artillery preparation had been effective. By midnight, the engineers had completed the first pontoon bridge, and vehicles began crossing. Dan's platoon moved forward in their assigned sequence, engines now rumbling at full volume as the need for stealth had passed. The Sherman's treads clanked onto the floating bridge, which swayed slightly under the 30-ton weight. Maintain minimum interval, Dan instructed his platoon. Steady speed, stay centered on the bridge. The crossing took on a dreamlike quality in the darkness, with muzzle flashes from distant fighting briefly illuminating the scene before returning it to shadow. Dan found himself holding his breath as they reached the midpoint of the river, their most vulnerable position. But they reached the eastern shore without incident, their tanks climbing the muddy bank to take up defensive positions around the bridgehead. As dawn approached, more Allied units poured across the expanding bridge network, transforming the precarious foothold into a substantial bridgehead. With first light, Dan could finally see Germany clearly. Rolling farmland interspersed with small villages and woodlots, not fundamentally different from the French and Luxembourg countryside they had fought through for months. Yet knowing this was German soil gave the landscape a different significance. The platoon pushed forward, now moving at maximum speed to minimize their exposure in the open ground. The morning mist gradually burned away under the spring sun, revealing the battlefield in increasing detail. They encountered their first resistance at a small crossroads 2 kilometers from the river. A German anti-tank gun opened fire from a concealed position in an orchard, its shell narrowly missing the lead tank. "Contact front," Dan called over the radio. Anti-tank gun in the orchard, 11 o'clock. All tanks deploy for engage front. His platoon executed the maneuver smoothly, spreading out to present multiple targets while bringing their guns to bear on the German position. Before they could fire, the attached infantry reported additional threats. Lieutenant, mines ahead, and infantry in the farmhouse to the right. The situation was developing into a classic German delaying action. A small force with prepared positions tying down a much larger attacking force, slowing their advance while minimizing German casualties. With Taylor at the controls, Dan Sherman moved forward carefully, using a shallow drainage ditch for partial cover as they maneuvered around the German position. The anti-tank gun fired again, this time striking one of the American tanks, but failing to penetrate its frontal armor. From their flanking position, Dan could now see the German gun emplacement clearly. A 75mm PaK-40 with a crew of 4, partially concealed by camouflage netting and earthworks. Gunner anti-tank position 2 o'clock, range 400 yards. Dan directed. Target acquired, Maxwell confirmed. Fire when ready. The Sherman's gun roared, and the shell struck directly into the German position, destroying the anti-tank gun and its crew in a single devastating hit. With their primary defensive weapon eliminated, the remaining German infantry began withdrawing from the farmhouse under covering fire from another position. This pattern repeated throughout the day, encountering small German delaying forces, engaging and overcoming them, then pushing forward toward their objectives. By nightfall, they had secured their objectives and established defensive positions, having advanced 7 kilometers from the Rhine in a single day. By late April, Allied forces had penetrated deep into Germany, with Soviet forces approaching Berlin from the east while American and British forces secured western and southern regions. The 4th Armored Division had pushed into Bavaria, approaching the Czechoslovakian border. On April 26, Dan's platoon participated in the liberation of a concentration camp near the town of Flossenburg. The experience marked every man who witnessed it, confronting them with horrors beyond their previous comprehension. Even combat veterans who had seen the worst of battlefield carnage found themselves stunned by the deliberate, industrialized cruelty evident in the camp's operation. Dan maintained his professional composure throughout the liberation operation, directing his tanks to secure the perimeter while medical units attended to the survivors. Only later, alone in his tank, did he allow himself a brief period of overwhelming grief, not just for his likely murdered family, but for all the victims of the regime they were finally defeating. That evening, the normally boisterous conversations around the platoon's cooking fires were subdued, each man processing what they had witnessed in his own way. Dan moved among them, checking on their welfare, particularly the younger replacements, who had never imagined such scenes even in their darkest thoughts about the war. "How do we make sense of this, Lieutenant?" asked a young replacement gunner who had joined the platoon only weeks earlier. "I'm not sure we can," Dan replied honestly. "Some things defy rational understanding. What matters is that we're stopping it and ensuring the world knows what happened here." On May 6, 1945, as they established positions near the border town of Pilsen, word came through official channels that German forces in the north had surrendered to British Field Marshal Montgomery. Rumors spread rapidly that a general surrender of all German forces was imminent. The next morning, May 7th, Dan was at his command tank reviewing maintenance reports when the radio crackled with an urgent all-stations message. "Attention all units, Able 6 actual," came the battalion commander's voice. "Stand by for important announcement." A moment of static followed, then Colonel Wilson's distinctive voice returned. "All units of the 37th Tank Battalion. At 02:41 hours this morning, representatives of the German High Command signed in surrender documents at SHAEF headquarters. Effective immediately, hostilities against German forces are to cease. The war in Europe is officially over. I repeat, the war in Europe is officially over." A stunned silence fell over the tank park, men freezing in place as they processed the momentous news. Then gradually, cheers erupted, growing in volume as the reality sank in. The war that had consumed their lives for years had ended in complete victory. Dan stood in his commander's hatch, watching his men celebrate, embracing, shouting, some firing their weapons into the air despite regulations against it. He felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that the killing had ended, pride in their role bringing about the Nazi defeat, grief for comrades lost along the way, and a private sorrow knowing that victory had come too late for millions of victims, likely including his own family. The following day, Dan received orders to report to division headquarters. There, among the organized chaos of a military command transitioning from war to occupation duties, he found Colonel Wilson. "Lieutenant Harrington," Wilson greeted him. "Congratulations on seeing this through to the end." "Thank you, sir. It's still sinking in." "For all of us," Wilson agreed. "I wanted to personally inform you about your next assignment. Division is establishing occupation administration in our sector. Given your language skills and performance record, you're being reassigned to military government operations, effective immediately." "Sir?" Dan was surprised by the sudden change. "You're being promoted to captain and transferred to the Counterintelligence Corps as a special agent," Wilson elaborated. "Your background makes you uniquely qualified for the role. Your mission will include denazification efforts, identification of war criminals, and," he paused significantly, "investigation of Nazi atrocities, including assisting displaced persons in locating missing family members." Dan understood immediately. This assignment would place him in a position to continue his personal search while fulfilling critical military duties. "Thank you, sir. I accept." Chapter 11, A Love Story Amid Ruins. The summer sun illuminated the ruined German city of Nuremberg as Captain Daniel Harrington's staff car navigated through streets cleared of rubble but still bearing the scars of intensive bombing and artillery. 3 months had passed since VE Day, and Dan had settled into his new role with the Counterintelligence Corps, investigating Nazi officials and assisting with the complex process of denazification. The military government had established translation services in major occupied cities, employing vetted German civilians with English language skills to facilitate communication between occupation forces and the local population. Dan's visit today concerned the screening of potential translators for security risks, a routine but necessary procedure in the complex post-war environment where former Nazi officials often attempted to conceal their backgrounds. The interior of the building presented a stark contrast. Hallways still showed damage from combat, with temporary repairs evident, while offices had been restored to functional condition with a mix of surviving German furniture and American military-issue equipment. A young American lieutenant met him at the designated office. "Captain Harrington, Lieutenant Morris, Translation Services Coordinator. Thank you for coming." "Of course. How many candidates are we reviewing today?" "6 in total. All have passed preliminary screening, but CIC requested final interviews before clearance." For the next hour, Dan interviewed 5 candidates, 3 men and 2 women, all Germans with varying levels of English proficiency and backgrounds that seemed appropriately distant from Nazi Party involvement. The 6th candidate was running late, Lieutenant Morris explained, due to transportation difficulties, a common problem in the damaged city with limited civilian transportation. "Her name is Elsa Mueller," Morris continued, handing Dan her file. 30 years old, excellent English and French, some Russian. Worked as a language instructor at Nuremberg University until 1943, then as a clerk in a military hospital. No Nazi Party membership found in records. Dan reviewed her denazification questionnaire, noting the standard declarations about lack of Nazi Party involvement in political activities during the Hitler years. Something about her employment history caught his attention. A gap between 1943 and 1944 explained simply as family matters. A knock at the door interrupted them. Lieutenant Morris opened it, revealing a slender woman in simple but neat civilian clothes. Elsa Mueller entered with dignified composure despite her slightly disheveled appearance from rushing. She was striking rather than conventionally beautiful. Intelligent blue eyes, light brown hair, tied back simply, and an expression that conveyed both strength and wariness. "I apologize for my tardiness," she said in English with only a slight German accent. "The tram service is still unpredictable." Dan began with routine questions about her background, education, and experience, watching her responses carefully for inconsistencies or signs of rehearsed answers. When he reached the gap in her employment history, he noted a subtle change in her demeanor, a slight tension in her shoulders, though her facial expression remained composed. "Your questionnaire indicates you left your teaching position in 1943 for family matters, then began work at the military hospital in 1944. Could you elaborate on that period?" She met his gaze directly. "My mother was ill, cancer. I returned to our family home near Munich to care for her until her death in December 1943. After settling her affairs, I moved to Nuremberg and secured the hospital position through a former colleague." Dan made a note, then asked, "Did your position give you access to information about military operations or Nazi Party activities?" A flicker of something, caution perhaps, crossed her features. I processed admission forms and maintained patient records. Most patients were wounded soldiers from the Eastern Front. I had no access to operational information. Dan approved her clearance, but with instructions to keep her assignments general for the first month while they verified the hospital employment details more thoroughly. Over the next several weeks, Dan encountered Elsa regularly during his visits to Nuremberg headquarters. She proved to be an exceptional translator, not merely converting words but conveying nuances that helped American officials better understand the German civilians they were dealing with. During one particularly complex negotiation regarding civilian food distribution, Dan observed her skillfully navigating a tense discussion between an impatient American supply officer and defensive German municipal officials. When the meeting concluded successfully, he approached her. "That was impressive work, Ms. Mueller. You did more than translate, you practically mediated." She accepted the compliment with a characteristic restraint. Language carries cultural assumptions that can derail communication if not properly contextualized. I simply provided that context where needed. Their professional relationship continued over the following months, gradually developing into a cautious friendship. Dan found himself looking forward to their interactions, impressed by her intelligence and resilience in the challenging post-war environment. In November 1945, 6 months after the war's end, the first major war crimes trial began in Nuremberg. As part of the CIC's supporting role, Dan was assigned to the team verifying documentary evidence and witness testimony. The work was emotionally taxing, requiring daily immersion in records of atrocities and systematic genocide. During this period, his interactions with Elsa became a welcome respite from the darkness of his primary duties. They occasionally met for coffee or lunch, discussing rebuilding efforts, literature, music, topics that reconnected them to humanity's better aspects after days spent documenting its worst. On a cold December afternoon, Dan found Elsa in the translation office, working late on documents related to civilian food allocation for the winter. She looked up as he entered, her expression warming slightly. "Captain Harrington, what brings you here after hours?" "Looking for you, actually. I need a translator for an interview tomorrow morning, someone with experience handling sensitive matters." "What kind of interview?" "A potential witness for the trials. German civilian who claims knowledge of deportation operations in Poland, particularly Warsaw." The mention of Warsaw and deportations caused a subtle but noticeable reaction. A momentary stillness, quickly controlled. "I see. What time tomorrow?" The following morning, they drove to a small hotel where the witness, a former German railway administrator named Schmidt, was staying under guard. The man had approached American authorities claiming insider knowledge of transportation arrangements for Jewish deportations from Warsaw to Treblinka. As Schmidt began describing his role in the Warsaw deportations, Dan occasionally glanced at Elsa to gauge her reactions. Her professional composure remained intact, but small signs, the tightness around her eyes, her slightly too perfect posture, suggested emotional strain beneath the surface. "I was responsible for scheduling train movements," Schmidt explained in German, with Elsa translating. "Special trains for the resettlement operations required coordination with military transports. My office processed the paperwork." "And you personally knew these trains were carrying Jewish civilians to death camps?" Dan asked directly. After Elsa translated, Schmidt shifted uncomfortably. "Not officially, no. The documentation used terms like resettlement and special treatment. But we knew. Those of us in the transportation office, the trains returned empty too quickly for actual resettlement." As the interview continued, Schmidt described particular transports from the Warsaw Ghetto in October 1942, the precise period when Dan's family had likely been deported. Dan maintained his professional detachment through years of practice, but internally each detail resonated with personal significance. After several hours of detailed testimony, they concluded the interview. Schmidt would be transferred to a more secure facility pending formal deposition for the trials. As they left the hotel, Dan noticed Elsa was uncharacteristically silent. "Would you like to stop for coffee before I take you back to headquarters?" he offered, concerned by her subdued demeanor. "No, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "Actually, I would prefer to walk back. The air would do me good." "It's quite cold today," Dan observed. "I'm happy to drive you." "I've developed a tolerance for discomfort, Captain," she replied with the ghost of a smile. "The walk will help me process what we've heard." Dan made a decision. "Then I'll walk with you, if you don't mind the company. I could use some processing time myself." They walked in silence through the damaged city, where reconstruction efforts continued despite the winter weather. After several blocks, Elsa finally spoke. "May I ask you a personal question, Captain?" "Of course." "The Warsaw deportations Schmidt described, they affected you personally, didn't they?" Dan considered deflecting the question but decided on honesty. "Yes, my family was in Warsaw when the ghetto was established. They were likely deported during the period he described." She stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "You're Jewish." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Yes." A complex series of emotions crossed her face. Sadness, guilt, something like relief. "I thought so. From certain patterns in your German. Polish-Jewish German has distinctive characteristics." "Your linguistic analysis is impressive as always," Dan said, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "There's something I need to tell you," Elsa said quietly. "Something not in my official records or denazification questionnaire." Alert to potential security implications, Dan's professional instincts engaged. "Go on." "That gap in my employment history, it wasn't only about caring for my mother, though she was indeed ill. From 1943 to 1940, I was involved with a network helping Jewish families hide from deportation in Munich." The revelation stunned him. "You were part of the resistance?" "A small part of a small network," she clarified. "My mother's illness provided cover for unusual movements and absences. We hid 3 families in rotation between safe houses. 2 eventually escaped to Switzerland. The third," she paused. "They were discovered. I narrowly avoided arrest myself." "That's why you left Munich." She nodded. "After my mother died, the Gestapo began investigating our neighborhood more intensively. A sympathetic police officer warned me I was under suspicion. I used my professional credentials to secure the hospital position in Nuremberg, where I was unknown." "Why tell me this now?" "Because today, listening to Schmidt describe the deportations so clinically, I couldn't maintain the pretense anymore." Her eyes met his directly. "And because I've come to respect you, you deserve to know who you're actually dealing with." "Do you understand that this admission could complicate your position with the military government?" Dan asked, thinking through the implications. "Yes, I falsified my denazification questionnaire by omission. But I couldn't bear to sit through that interview, hearing about Warsaw, knowing what your family likely experienced, without telling you the truth." "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly. "Help Jewish families when most Germans looked away?" She considered the question carefully. "I was raised in a traditional Lutheran household with strong emphasis on moral responsibility. When the deportations became known in academic circles, not the details, but enough to understand something terrible was happening, I couldn't reconcile continued compliance with my conscience." "That took exceptional courage," Dan observed. "Not exceptional enough," she replied, genuine pain crossing her features. "Not soon enough for millions, including, perhaps, your family." The personal connection hung between them, his family's fate and her efforts to save others like them, creating an unexpected bond across the divide of war. 2 years later, in the spring of 1947, Captain Daniel Harrington stood in a modest registry office in Frankfurt. Beside him stood Elsa Muller, now his bride, as they signed the marriage documents that would officially unite their lives. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully, both cognizant of the complex historical forces that had shaped their paths. Dan's mother, who had initially refused all contact with his German wife, had finally relented after meeting Elsa during a visit to America. It had taken 3 years, but the strong-willed Polish-Jewish woman had eventually embraced the German woman who had risked everything to save others like her. As they left the registry office, arm in arm, Dan reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From illegal immigrant to tank commander to intelligence officer, from the devastation of war to the promise of renewal. The war had taken his first family, but in its ashes he had found a new one, a testament to the human capacity to rebuild even after the most profound devastation. "What are you thinking about?" Elsa asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "About steel," he replied. "How fire can either destroy it or make it stronger." She understood immediately, squeezing his arm gently as they walked toward their future together. 2 survivors of history's darkest chapter finding in each other the strength to forge something new from the ruins of the past.